Hello, and thank you for joining us in Map Zone, a podcast dedicated to highly fixated, large, dense books, specifically current, but not forever, the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Kate, and I'm one of the co-hosts.
My name is Cody.
And I'm Will.
And today we are in our very last episode of Bleeding Edge, covering season 4 of the podcast now for about 4 months. Just shy of 4 months. They're like, what, April 4th?
April 7th was the first day we recorded for it, yeah.
So just over 4 months of Bleeding Edge. The last section of chapters here is chapter 40 and 41. Just really kind of wrap up stuff here, and that'll bring us to a close on our 4th book, and that also puts us halfway through Pynchon's canon, which is kind of crazy to think about.
Yeah, it really is.
What did you guys think of chapter 40 and 41?
I forgot how much I really liked the ending of this book.
Mm-hmm.
I think I think this is part of why people don't like this book, is that it's, while mostly everyone's individual plot lines are pretty well wrapped up, there are a lot of unanswered questions at the end of the book, which I think can be off-putting for some people. And I get it. I mean, it's definitely a valid complaint. I particularly don't have a problem with it. I think that grounds it a little more and adds to the realism of it. I think that there was so much, especially if we're looking at this in context of 9/11 and the surrounding social events and the shift in the zeitgeist and everything that occurred around that as well. There is still a lot of unknowns that surround that. And so I think to leave a lot of those ambiguous works in favor of the book itself. That being said, as far as the character arcs that wrapped up, I absolutely loved it. The end scene with Maxine and the boys absolutely wrecked me. And
yeah, geez.
That one got some tears going for sure. It's stunning. I really truly had forgotten how great the end of this book is.
Well, I have some slightly less charitable theories on why people don't appreciate this book.
Excited.
That's not the time for those. This is not that time.
Roasted.
It is.
No, I mean, I don't know. It feels like more of a wrap-up thing, but throughout our conversation for this episode, I think we'll get to some of those. But I do agree. I mean, last week, you didn't hear, Kate, but I went on quite a rant about the parting words of Sean.
Yeah.
Okay.
And what didn't make it to the podcast at all, I don't think, is that I spent a lot of my prep time for the episode just like maybe 6 hours the preceding day, if I'm being honest with myself, just trying to figure out that sentence. The other thing that I squandered my important prep time on was skimming ahead and finding, not finding for the first time, but remembering those last couple pages, and just I just spent the next few hours then just crying and thinking about how beautiful it is to the concept of, not necessarily literally being a parent, but of making the world of tomorrow in the ways that all people can, but parents very acutely feel.
Right. Yeah.
Just such an incredibly emotionally strong ending to the book. And chapter 40 is so much fun in contrast, not in direct contrast, but definitely to go from such not silly really, because it's the subject matter's rather serious, but all the details are so silly. To go from that into a mother and daughter finally reconnecting and finally being willing to spend time together, and just the the melancholy of the end of a book combined with the melancholy that Maxine feels, as her kids take themselves to school. It's not quite whiplash, but it's an intense ending.
Yeah, well, she's finally become a Yenta. Despite constantly attempting to keep herself from becoming that for most of the book. Oh man, no, I agree. I think this book is, as I've mentioned many times, it is one of my favorites. It's one or two probably, but of course I can't be 100% sure until I've read everything. So in that case, I still have to read, Against the Day and all that. But it is such an excellent ending, not just because of the emotional stuff the two of you have already laid out very well, but also because it is intertwined with how the hard-boiled detective stories that it is aping also, where it perfectly runs for the length of a year. In the beginning of the book, it talks about the budding of the pear trees, and then at the very end of the book, it talks about the budding of the pear trees again. But it also gives this sense that like all of this shit just happened and now it's over and we're just moving on to a new phase of the detective's life. Like this is how Philip Marlowe's life goes.
Yeah,
like
basically,
someone wanders into Philip Marlowe's office and then his life falls apart for like the better part of a couple of months to a year, and then it's over, and then he just goes back to his office in time for someone else to wander in asking for him to take him to Mexico in the middle of the night, and then his life falls apart again for like another like good 6 months or whatever, and then he goes back to his office for someone else to come in talking about tax fraud or whatever. Like it's such a great way that he is again taking those tropes or that design of the detective or the hard-boiled story and then elevating it. This book in a lot of ways is sort of like going to like an expensive restaurant that has grilled cheese on the menu, where it's like, yeah, this is a really simple dish, but the fact that it's here, it probably means
$25.
that it's going to cost $25, which is about the cost of a paperback book anyway. But then also is like is going to be really fucking good, like the best grilled cheese I've ever had. And I love the scenes with Callus and March, and all of the like really beautiful like familial love that he writes in here. Like he just became like a big softie after he got married and had a kid. And it's just really nice to have all of that present. But then, there's that great moment where Gabriel Ice shows up and how he depicts Gabriel Ice for the last time. There's a lot of good wrap up stuff in here, but mostly it's just nice. It feels like, aside from the Misha and Grisha stuff, it feels like a very like warm blanket being pulled over you.
It really does. It's a very there's a lot of hope at the end of this book. Right. And I think the only other of his books that I really felt that way about was Against the Day. But yeah, I finished reading this for this week while I was sitting at a haircut place while my son was getting his haircut. And so it was kind of this like full circle moment for Maxine and, returning back to her kids going back to school, and my kids are about to start school in a week. And it just really, I'm sitting in the corner of a haircut place. I can't remember which one I took him to. And I'm fucking crying and like trying to like hide in the darkness. So no, like thankfully there was like one other guy in there and he was off on another side doing something else. So I could have my moment in the shadows. But as a parent, it hits very hard.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like I told you, I was weeping in the laundromat several times while reading Vineland and this book. Where it's just like, nobody look at the worst part about that laundromat I go to too. Like, I go to it because it's freaking so clean. I don't know how they keep this laundromat in a busy city center this clean, but it's always so clean. It's always very comfortable temperature in there. But it's everyone else also knows how good the laundromat is, so it is packed all the time.
Yeah.
And I'm just sitting there crying into my book as people wash 7 loads of like towels or whatever, and I wonder where they're going with all those. So that brings up the next question of like, how has your perception of this book changed from when you had last read it to now reading it for the show?
I think the last time I read it was 3 years ago, maybe 4.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember liking it, and that was about it. It didn't really stick with me. And I think part of that was just, if I remember correct, the time at which I read it, I wasn't really reading it as in depth. And I don't know if that was because the stigma that existed around it just kind of kept me from wanting to even bother trying to really dive into it, or if it was just other things going on that I wasn't really aware of that kept me from really doing it, or the fact that, like I mentioned, I think in last week's episode, that this book, the way it's written and the way it reads, especially when I was rereading it for this, there were times where I forgot I was rereading it for a podcast and needed to like really slow down and take notes and everything, because I would just get so wrapped up in the plot and everything that was going on that I would just get ahead of where I was and just realize, holy shit, I need to go back and like actually take notes and think about what I want to talk about with this, rather than just really taking the ride and enjoying it the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
So on that note, it definitely has moved up in terms of where I would place it among his other works. It's not my favorite by any means, but it is, I think I hold it in higher esteem now. And part of that may also just be from having these conversations with you all and being able to, glean a lot of things out of it that I hadn't seen before or that I hadn't considered before. But it's definitely grown in appreciation quite a lot for me.
Yeah, I mean, my shift is, I think, on a very, very straightforward level, going to be the smallest compared to anyone else's, because the last time I read the book was about 2 weeks before we started recording the podcast on it. It was also the first time I read the book. And, on top of the fact that, I came into the book for the first time with the mindset of doing this podcast, and with the conversations that we'd been having about Vineland and, Mason and Dixon. On top of all of that, it was the last Pynchon book that I read, or the last of his novels. I have not read all of Slow Learner as of yet. As I said at the beginning of the show, I ranked it relatively low. And as of a couple of episodes back, I revised that quite vaguely. And at this point, I'm not. It's not my favorite book of his, but it is definitely a contender. Like it is a. I do truly understand, and this has, I think, primarily come out of our conversations. I do understand your perspective that I pushed back on Kate with, saying that it was a supplantation of Gravity's Rainbow. As I said, a few episodes into covering this book, I still don't agree with that. But I do get where you're coming from, and I do understand that interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, aside from my generally exegetic approach to reading any book, but especially Pynchon's novels, I would like to say that I have to push back a little bit on what both of y'all said just a few minutes ago. I don't know if this is one of the more hopeful endings. I think that that this ending is both while it is hopeful, I think a lot of people underrate, don't quite give credence to the degree of hope that Gravity's Rainbow ends with. But also, I think that this ending is darker than the emotional side of things. Kind of what makes us want to believe it is. And I don't think that I quite had digested the grimness of the outlook of this book as a whole my first time through it. Because, it's while things look like they're going to be okay, aside from maybe the relationship between Maxine and Horst, I think there's a lot of movement in a way that doesn't make me hopeful.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, it I went from thinking of this book as well, I think stylistically it is more experimental than it's almost ever given credit for. I do also think that, and I also think that the characterization is as good as we have become kind of a metronome on in the last few episodes. And I think that between those things, I mean, that this is a great novel. I might not personally prefer it to, what are usually called his big three books. And I don't think it's from like a technical, formalistic, sophomoric kind of level of distillation of things as The Crying of Lot 49. I think it does all of the things that Lot 49 does, but better. I think it captures a lot of the human level of those, again, the quote unquote big three books a lot more, a lot more clearly and a lot more earnestly than at least most people are willing to read those books as. So those are my changed thoughts.
Sure.
Regarding the grimness of it, you're not wrong. I definitely think it is at times very grim, and especially that bleeds through when we see the conversations like we talked about last week between like Maxine and Ernie and Maxine and March, where you have these very moments of Pynchon clearly writing, through his eyes, through a character, putting his words into that character. When I say it has a hopeful ending, I think what I'm referring to there is it in the sense of that hope that Maxine and at least me as a reader, that hope that the future can be better than what we've given them. That we have left and I say that, given the fact this book was written, 10 years ago and takes place 20 years ago, but we really gave the younger generations a shit hand, undoubtedly. But I think they're almost, at this point, I think the current young generation is more suited to handle it and to turn things around than previous generations. Not to say there weren't capable parts of those generations, but just the way that things have changed both in society and technologically. I think we're at a point now where the younger generation can finally kind of empower themselves to a higher degree than they ever have been able to. So I think that's where that hope comes from, is that Maxine and myself as a reader, I can see her looking at Ziggy and Otis and thinking, okay, I am comfortable letting them go. And because I know that they have the capability and the power and the willingness to take everything that we've tried to teach them and utilize that to turn things around and make the world that they deserve. Their Zygotosopolis, to make that real. That's where I think the hope comes in. It is literally at the very end in a very grim journey, but I think it is there.
I think it's both. I think that it's grim in the sense that, like, especially coming from Gabriel Ice making that proclamation of "There's no scenario in which I die," like just screaming that at Maxine as she's pointing a gun at him, and like the indication of what that means from a standpoint of, first of all, that is a quote taken from Josh Harris, but secondly, from the perspective of the fact that, like, even if Maxine does kill him, he will be alive in Deep Archer. He will be alive in the world that he has helped create by bringing the towers down. Like, there is no scenario Gabriel Ice dies, and that is very bleak, and that's very, like, that is, life-alteringly terrifying from a perspective of what that means, and of the new millennium that's been ushered in, that started with DARPANET and everything that Ernie talks about, right? So that is all very true. I think that the hope comes from what Cody just said, from the perspective of her seeing Ziggy and Otis in real life, just like how they are in this like beautiful city that they created at Deep Archer, with the help of who knows who all of those other people are that like contributed to it. But the city as she describes it in Deep Archer is this like pre-Giuliani, pre-yuppified like utopia of New York that a lot of people would have in their mind as like the idealized and how they're the same in real life as they are there. So maybe that means that they are going to be okay and that their generation is going to be okay. And obviously those last couple sentences are kind of have a double meaning of like, yeah, we're okay going to the school, Mom, but also, you know, she may be thinking it from a perspective of the fact that what they represent is also potentially okay. They're the very better than her generation. And I think I was reminded this time through a lot of the way that the principal characters of White Noise feel about their child Wilder. How Babette and God, what is the guy's name? It's something real, just default white guy name. For the way that they talk about Wilder, how like, you know, he's so perfect, he doesn't have that like fear of death in him yet. He doesn't have that fear of like the outside world in him yet. I wish I could be like that. That was what I was reminded of a lot by. So I think it's both. I think it's both pretty bleak from a standpoint of like, this is the world we live in now, and it's fucking existentially terrifying, and everybody's like slowly regressing into being children through like pure unalloyed pleasure by way of technology. But at the same time, maybe the people after us are going to be okay. Like it's this old hippie who's been through this twice, hoping that maybe third time's the charm.
Yeah. So I just to clarify, the grimness I only mentioned in relation to how I read the book the first time through.
Sure.
I don't doubt that both of you understand the grimness of the themes going on here. And I was really only trying to say that I think that, you know, this is a slightly less hopeful ending of a book than Mason and Dixon. I think it's less hopeful than Against the Day. I think it's less hopeful than Vineland even. And I mean, I'm not gonna go into it. I read Gravity's Rainbow as angry as that is, honestly more hopeful than this book concludes with.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of that is the fact that Pynchon has no fucking clue what happens now. Like,
yeah.
You know, if you're looking at these books as like a chronological perspective, as this alternate American history, as we've started to talk a lot about, like he was alive through all of that, and like when you get to the point where you're in your late 70s, or when he published this book approaching his 70s, you know, I think there's less understanding of like I don't know, the planet's like fucking decimated, the Twin Towers were destroyed, and now here we are in this world that we're living in. Like what? Where do we go? I don't know where we go. Hopefully the kids are all right. Like,
yeah,
you know, especially if you're looking at it from a chronological perspective, you know, there was an opportunity for hope in a lot of the earlier work that just isn't present here because of how contemporaneous it was to the time it was published. Like when this book came out, the first iPhone had only come out 7 years prior. Like it's weird already to read this book in 2024 and then look back and be like, oh yeah, when this book was published, like things were actually kind of better still. like a lot of the stuff that he's talking about here is like, it's like just gotten worse.
Yeah.
Well, and the thing is that I feel like the reason that I am slightly, you know, ignoring the maybe miscommunication, but you know, on top of that, I still feel like I read it as slightly less hopeful than y'all do, only because I think that it kind of rests upon this whole book being, in a lot of ways, an exploration of maybe Pynchon himself coming to terms with the fact that not to imply that he was, while he was writing his earlier books, that he was thinking, I'm right about everything and I know what the future is going to be. But coming to terms with, being able to be wrong about things and being okay with that.
Mm.
And it feels like it's the reason that Maxine is the age she is in particular, aside from convenience of plot and Yenta jokes, is
funny of those.
Yeah, is that in the beginning of our middle-aged lives, people kind of have to come to terms with those limitations. And I feel like a lot of what we have been reading as direct authorial insert in the form of March and Ernie might be slightly better read as kind of a self-parody of himself when he was younger, and viewing that through the eyes of someone who is younger, and then people who are even a generation younger than that, and with that kind of with the optimism at the end of this book being built on that kind of alloyed, just going on faith hope. I have a hard time reading it so bright, I guess.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like the difference between the sheen of chromed steel and polished titanium, if either of you have experience with that.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a distinct, I think there's less luster, even if the brightness is still there.
Yeah, I can definitely see what you're saying, for sure. As far as my thoughts have changed from previous readings now, I do kind of like your interpretation, Will. This is like the New Testament to Gravity's Rainbow is Old Testament. I think the reason I look at it as like a new Bible as opposed to sort of a continuation or a New Testament, the idea that everything moved online, which I don't think he would have anticipated, and the differences that kind of come with that, or why there's sort of a need for a new declaration or a new Bible, so to speak. But I think the biggest thing that's changed for me from a standpoint of the times that I've read it before to now is understanding all of the different connections to his other work, which I think has to do more so with how we've recorded this podcast. I mean, the amount of times that I reference stuff in Mason and Dixon and in Vineland in my annotations, my notes for this read through, is significant. Like,
Yeah.
The degree to which doing these books in pretty quick succession and also talking, for 3 hours a week on a couple chapters worth of them every single week for the better part of 2 years now, has led me to see the connections that exist within his material that I had not previously noticed were there. Because if you read these books really far apart from one another, or if you read these books without sort of someone to bounce off the different ideas that are inherent to them, you can kind of come away with the fact that a lot of them are pretty isolated. There are crossovers of maybe a character from one shows up in the other, or maybe the reference to this band that's in one shows up in another. But from a standpoint of the way in which they are interconnected, that's very easy to miss unless you're spending just a lot of time with the man, which the four of us have spent a significant amount of time with this man over the course of the last year and a half.
Yeah.
And so really seeing especially kind of with the last three that we've done, Mason and Dixon being a really long time ago, the foundations of the country, Vineland being the height of, I guess, evil at that point, given the Reagan administration and the kind of final breakup of the countercultural movements, and then finally this book, Bleeding Edge, being sort of the dawn of a new age or new epoch as far as what living in the 21st century looks like. It's sort of is an interesting microcosm of a lot of the stuff that he goes through, I assume, from all of his books, if you read them chronologically from that. So that would be, I would say, the biggest thing that I kind of picked up on and really enjoyed, was being able to understand how this book fits into the larger narrative of his work as a writer, and how that knowledge further informs my belief and understanding that this is kind of the closing of his writing, that he has nothing else to do after.
Yeah, it definitely feels like a firm punctuation mark on a career as a writer. I think that comes through pretty clearly that he's pretty much said everything he can say at this point with this and everything that came before it. So, but yeah, I do like that, what you brought up about the interconnectedness of everything, because that's definitely something that I have picked up on over the year and a half that we've been doing this, that, again, it's easy to catch the characters that are there and to catch the very obvious connection points between them. But yeah, when you really start to spend this much time at this granular of a level and doing them back to back like we have been, yeah, those dots start to connect a lot more clearly, and you start to see a lot more of them.
Oh yeah, 100%. It's been really quite a pleasure to experience that. Which, not that I would ever recommend anyone do this, but he did want to copy us from a perspective of like reading all of his work back to back chronologically. It's pretty cool. Like I can recommend it, but that's like a very large project to throw on yourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when we started this show, I had the first Finchon book I read was Mason and Dixon, and I had read it about 2 years before we started discussing making this podcast. So I kind of jumped in with that attitude, because I hadn't finished Against the Day and I hadn't read this book yet, but I had read all of the others. And so, yeah, it is interesting to hear the contrast in those, because I can honestly say, like you said, maybe not a recommendation. It's a real experience to for like 2 years to just read, but to read Thomas Pynchon's works in aggregate. It's a very specific thing.
It is a very specific thing. All right, so starting with chapter 40, we're given a lovely sort of aside to the rise of state-of-the-art health clubs, which were not always necessarily the most popular things, but Maxine is no longer feeling comfortable swimming at the Deseret pool, so she starts going to a place called Mega Reps. And I love the description of this, where Maxine is showing her sister Brooke's state-of-the-art health club, Mega Reps, around the corner, but isn't quite used to yet this nightly spectacle of yups on treadmills plodding to nowhere while watching CNN or the sports channel. Laid-off.comers who aren't at strip clubs are absorbed into massively multiplayer online games, all running, rowing, lifting weights, mingling with body image obsessives. Folks recuperating from dating disasters. Others desperate enough tonight actually be looking for company here instead of in bars. Worse, hanging around the snack section, which is where Maxine, coming in and out of a strange kind of late winter rain that you can hear rattling lightly off your umbrella or raincoat. But when you look, nothing is getting wet, finds March Gallagher. I don't know. I doubt Thomas Pynchon spends time at like a modern gym. I find it very hard to imagine him in that environment.
I think he did for this, because I think March is essentially him watching this, because I have been in gyms that's exactly what it's like.
This is exactly what they're like now, yeah.
And there's always a person sitting off on the side that's just like sitting there waiting for someone and just snacking on things with empty coffee cups around.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, surrounded by muffin debris.
Yeah.
But we figure out that she's still doing her thing where she's running around using free internet that she can't track, or biking, but with no bike, I suppose, the right way to describe what she's. But from there, they just sort of have a brief catch up where March talks about the fact that pretty worried about Talus because her and Gabriel are going to be getting divorced, and Talus has been kicked out of their house, their consummate throne room. Which, by the way, I was at the Artists Institute of Chicago last weekend. That's why I couldn't be on the episode. They had a lot of Cy Twombly art at the contemporary art section of the museum. Yeah, and now that I have read this book again, and we talked about his art on that episode where they talked about it, I had a completely different feeling towards those pieces when I was walking around looking at them. Just thinking that a guy as absolutely boorish as Gabriel Isis has this on his wall is just really comedic. Yeah. So Maxine gives her sort of the offer that she can go check in on her, and even though March initially kind of hesitates, she decides to do it anyway. And then we get a glimpse at Talus's living situation now. Does someone want to read the quote on 450, starting with Talus right at that paragraph, and tell like locals you can ask even tell you about it?
Talus, booted out of the East Side stately home she and Ice were sharing, has found a utility closet converted to a residential use in one of the new high-rises up on the far Upper East Side. Looks like a machine more than a building. Pale, metallic, highly reflective, someplace up in the mid two figures with respect to floors high, wraparound balconies that look like cooling fins. No name, only a number hidden so discreetly, not one in 100 locals you ask can even tell you it.
Which is just like such a true depiction of what these like luxury apartment buildings look like.
Yeah.
There's a lot of them in the city that I live in that have been being built over the past few years, and it's just like they're all so they all look like that. And I also love the like the when they leave, and it says on 453 they proceed to the elevator down 20 floors out through the gold accented grand central sized lobby with 4 figures per day floral arrangements. That's also so true. It's luxury for the building, not for the apartments. like the apartments themselves, when you like live in them, or if you like know people who live in them, they're pretty small. They're not as small as the one that Talos is living in. That's, a unique facet of New York real estate. But like they're pretty small for the money that you're paying. You still have to pay like all of your utilities basically. Like they charge you for parking. Like the flooring is substandard. Like sure, you do get brand new appliances and like a pretty good shower, but like it is nothing compared to like all of the other amenities. There is a building in the place that I live that has a grocery store in it. It has a local restaurant that is very highly regarded. There is a Starbucks. There is a pet store. There is also like a rooftop pool and lounge area. There are trash chutes that you can just throw your garbage down instead of having to bag stuff up and take it down to like a dumpster. There is like a list of an insane amount of amenities like this. And then when you go into one of the apartments, you're like, oh, so you're paying $2,000 a month for like a Converse box.
In the pod of a spaceship. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I guess it's cool that you don't ever have to leave this building, but at what cost?
And those apartments always feel like you're like, unless you have a window open, you're going to run out of oxygen in a short amount of time.
Yeah, absolutely. So she goes in there and Talos is drinking Hypnotic. I've not had it. Something about electric blue liquor just doesn't sit right with me.
You don't want fluorescent drinks?
I don't think so. Also, like, have you looked up what Hypnotic is supposed to taste like?
I have not.
It's a weird flavor for that color. It's supposed to be like mango, citrus, and tropical fruit.
Fuck?
Yeah.
That's weird.
And so why that would translate to like turquoise is like beyond. It's a blend of vodka, cognac, and then like fruit.
Well, and I love the I love the inclusion of cognac, because if you're adding fruit juice in and you need to add vodka, then you're not adding enough cognac for the cognac to actually be doing anything for the flavor.
Right.
It is just like an excuse to say it has cognac in it.
Yeah, basically.
For the perceived prestige of cognac.
Yeah, I mean it's such kind of in itself a recapitulation of kind of the point. I don't know if you were consciously driving at, but the book, I think, is certainly doing so with kind of the way that these apartment towers, these condos, are like they're like a statue dedicated to selling itself that doesn't actually mean anything. Like living there doesn't make your life better. It's not actually like living in a small apartment over a small business. You're living in a small apartment that is making a ton of money for somebody who you're not benefiting from actually this luxury, except that you get to say that you live there.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Like, and they do have names now, like as opposed to just a number where it's like, oh, I'm living in the Armory, or like I'm I'm living at the factory district, or just like some like perceived fancy name like that. But you're absolutely right, Will. That down to the liquor she drinks, it is a very good description of like not only the environs that she finds herself in, kind of how she is now. You know, she probably could have just drank like Napoleonic brandy a couple days ago, but now is reduced to drinking Hypnotic, which was very popular in the early 2000s. I do remember it being like
It definitely had
popular
its
choice.
time. Yeah.
Yeah, it turns out that the way that Gabriel Ice has gone about sort of breaking up their relationship is pretty gross. Like, he took away her internet access essentially, and was like slowly deleting her name from anything to do with the company or anywhere from the internet. Later on, she describes herself as like actually being the history of her like personhood being erased, which
Yeah.
you know,
Very
for the-
Vineland.
yeah, absolutely. Which for the time frame that would require sort of your internet presence to be removed from the World Wide Web. It's just a very evil way to go about it. Then suddenly, it turns out that this was his plan all along, and she gets screamed at. He throws her stuff out the window, and just sort of like berates her until she runs out. It turns out that part of this, or at least in theory, part of this is the fact that she was in the middle of having an affair, but Maxine also informs her that the person she's affair with works for Gabriel Light. So he's just like a real stone cold like piece of work. Just a real terrible individual.
Which it makes it worse to remember that he is based on a real person. At least parts of him are, and this absolutely is pretty much how it played out in We Live in Public. Like he had a complete meltdown when I feel bad because I can't remember her name now. The woman he was living with and essentially doing this whole experiment with wanted out, and he became a literal abusive asshole and just tried to shut her down entirely. It was horrifying to watch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those scenes of that documentary are pretty rough, and it's just I can't believe that was something that. Well, no, never mind. I can't believe that a bunch of people were watching that, like with rap.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. We also get a brief aside that that Dieter suddenly finds himself flushed with work for all these different sort of memorials and funerals that have happened post 9/11, where they just need bagpipe players. Except for the cop funerals, they have their own bagpipers. They don't need a freelance bagpipe.
They've got their people.
Yeah, exactly. And that the two of them are kind of working together to do something. There's no further elucidation of what they might be working on together, but just a funny callback to like who his roommate in college used to be. If you remember that from like 300 pages. At that point, Maxine discovers that there's a CCTV camera in the apartment, and so the two of them decide to make their way out of the building, where they run into Misha and Grisha driving their dad's car. These two characters I kind of forgot from the last time I read it, the evolution they sort of go on over
I did too.
Because they kind of start out as just like almost children from the way that they're presented, playing, you know, Doom on their little devices and just sort of being kind of like weird and idiosyncratic kids, to like being just straight up gangsters, or at least wannabe gangsters by the end of the book. It's a very interesting sort of character evolution that the two of them go on.
Well, I think it's, if you look at how quickly kids seem to grow up online, I think that kind of that's how I see them. They're the exposure to things that they see online rapidly, I don't want to say matures them, but it definitely accelerates their sort of emotional growth, for better or worse, really. Because they go from this very not necessarily innocent, but they're just playing Doom and being goofy, and now they're just full on trying to be Russian mobsters and setting up this chain of events that's to come, and it's a wild difference from how they were not too long ago.
Well, I wanted to ask, do we actually have a verbal confirmation from either either of them or Igor that they are his children, because they're just kind of introduced as two people who are there who are playing Doom. And I think, we all assume, and I think it's kind of, it might have been intentional misdirection from Igor to say that these are his children when they're, he's probably like in his 50s and they're, late 20s. But could they just be two torpedoes, as they're constantly referred to?
That's a good question. I've never actually considered that.
Yeah, I can't recall them explicitly being said to be Igor's kids or of any relation to him, really. He's just always with them.
Because we'd have to go back to the chapter where she goes...
Where they got introduced.
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now. There's no mention of them, and then in the booth adjoining, Maxine notices two young torpedoes of a certain dimension, busy with handheld game consoles. Doom, Igor, waving a thumb, just came out for the Game Boy. Post-late capitalism run amok. United Aerospace Corporation, Moons of Mars, Gateways to Hell, Zombies and Demons, including, I think, these two, Misha and Grisha. Say hello, Padonki. I don't think there's any other mention of, relation, or not any further mention of relation in that scene.
Fascinating. Yeah, you're probably right. They probably are not his.
Yeah.
Well, and they might be, and maybe Maxine thinks they are.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it just comes from the fact that Maxine and Rocky are talking about their kids, and then Igor can relate because he's working with these two ne'er-do-wells.
Ne'er-do-wells is a perfect way to describe these two children.
Yeah. I mean, they do have access to his car, and they spend a lot of time with him. So, but again, yeah, it's never explicitly stated that they are related, or even that he's like a caretaker to them or anything. I don't know. That's interesting. I had never considered that.
No, I hadn't either. As it turns out, they are at the apartment to potentially kidnap Alice because Gabrielites might be ransoming her. This hasn't actually been contracted out at all. They just sort of think that maybe that'll happen, and so they should be at the forefront of it.
Very forward-thinking individuals.
Yeah. This is very half-baked plot that they're engaging in when they show up outside, and it also turns out that that they really don't like Gabrielites at all. That he probably wouldn't have any intention to pay them at all, even if this was something they were doing for him for sure. They call him an oligarch, scum, thief, and a murderer, which is all very true. And then it's at this point where they reveal the real thing that they're needing Alice for, which is the location of the server farm that Ashlingers uses at Lake Heatsink, which is a computer component. Is that the real name of the lake? Did anyone actually do research on that?
I meant to look that up and I never did. It slipped my mind. It seems too on the nose to be real, but
yeah,
you never know.
It doesn't. I couldn't find anything that would prove it was real, but I think that part of that could be the fact that, if you look up the word heatsink, you're just going to get actual heat sinks for computers.
Mm-hmm.
But it's an interesting decision of a name for a place.
Well, yeah, I mean, it goes. I think it might have been chosen because if it isn't real, because as far as you would think that heatsink would not be the name of a lake,
right?
So if it's a real name, then it's probably some, essentially we're mispronouncing some native language in some.
Yeah.
I don't know how it would be pronounced, or it was chosen because you could supposedly construe that Kiatsink was actually some Algonquin language family just because of the letters in the name.
Mm-hmm. Which that gets into the introduction of this lake, because that actually comes from not the Iroquois. That's what Taos thinks it is, but Mohawk for firefly. I don't want to attempt to pronounce the word as it's written on the page because there's a lot of T's in there, and a lot of interesting word construction letters in there. But apparently, she used to go to that lake quite a bit when she was younger because there was a Trotskyite associated Marxist summer camp there that her parents sent her to. Does someone want to read that quote on 457 that says, "Oh, your God, what?"
Sure. Oh, your God, what, Talus? Somebody had to. Camp Tawat Sirakwis was the brainchild of a Trotskyite couple, the Gimmelmans from Cedarhurst, begun back at the time of the Schachtman unpleasantness amid epical all-night screaming matches and not much quieter by the time Maxine got there. The standard poison ivy facility you found back then all through the mountains of New York State. Cafeteria food, color wars, canoes on the lake, singing, marching to Astoria, Zungali Gali, dance parties. Ah, Wesley Epstein.
This is such a random kind of aside because it does have some reference to a real thing. The Schachtman unpleasantness. Max Schachtman, he was, according to the Pinch on Wiki, says it was an American Marxist theorist. He evolved from being an associate of Leon Trotsky to a social democrat and a mentor of senior assistants to the AFL-CIO president George Meany. In 1938, Schachtman shocked Trotsky by publishing an article in the New International in which James Burnham declared his opposition to dialectical materialism, philosophy of Marxism. Although Trotsky reassured Schachtman, "I did not deny in the least the usefulness of the article you and Burnham wrote. The issue would soon be revived as Schachtman and Trotsky clashed on the outbreak of World War II." It's what a crazy, just kind of aside. The fact that there seems to be potentially Maxine remembering a crush that she had at the camp, and that's how her like remembrance of it ends with Wesley Epstein. Like the fact that they do songs that were sung by Archie Bunker with marching to a store. Like there's so many just random jokes and history involved in this one like random memory that Maxine has of something that she did in the summer.
Mm-hmm.
But that leads over to how it's described as what it actually is. Lake Heatsink is named that because it is colder and deeper than any other place in the Adirondack. And so she's reminded that, Gabriel Ice wants to go up north to the Arctic in order to sort of bury all the server farms out there because they're going to need a lot of cooling power. We also get some local color about the lake in that it is considered sort of evil or haunted. The indigenous folks avoided the place because of the, quote, in terror of what lived in its depths, cloak-shaped rays of glowing ultraviolet giant albino eels that could get around on land as well as through water, with demonic faces that spoke to you in Iroquois of the horrors that awaited you should you dip too much. Oh. To which Grisha says, "Make her stop, she's scaring me." And any thoughts on the lake or why Gabriel Ice is keeping his stuff there beyond just sort of what's obviously on the page?
I don't think there's any reason beyond what's there. I do just like the inclusion of the fact that that place is considered to be the last patches of innocence on the planet, which harkens back to so much of his work talking about the corruption of all these different parts of the land and how America kind of was that last section of it, and now we've gone into even more micro view of this small patch of land is the final part of this country that is uncorrupted, and it's about to go and be changed just because Gabriel Ice needs his server farm.
It is certainly a good outgrowth of like what his character represents as far as a corrupting force. It turns out that what Misha and Grisha wants the information on its location for is to not launch missiles at it, but rather to let off a small EM pulse to shut it off. And that it's actually just an experiment because they're only using it on 10% power. No reason to be concerned, Maxine.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Which they then go back and forth about the fact that that Igor trusts her, so they can too, and that they're doing this in effect to once again get back for Lester Crepes, which we get more indication of what that is about here. Does anyone have any ideas on the reason for the inclusion of the Halo jump story, or the Hey-Ho jump story, as it's probably more accurately told?
I couldn't really parse anything out of that. I'm sure there's something to do with the fact that it's specifically the Heiho is what it was. So I'm sure there's a reason for that. And I mean, all I know about it is that, they have more time to glide and get to a specific point. I don't know what the benefits of that would be, but I'm sure there is one.
Yeah, it just seems like all it does is sort of give you the background of how he stopped working for the government and kind of went into business for himself. That was really all I could kind of pull out of it from an importance perspective.
Well, all I can, beyond those things, I think that it also lends some credence to the idea that Igor does have this grievance with Gabrielice, that he was willing to compromise on his ideals when he realized how these insurgents, they weren't insurgents at the time, but how these people in the Caucasus were being oppressed by the Soviet Union. And he was willing to play both sides in that way, and he set himself up as this an avenue to get funds to the then later insurgents. And so him seeing Gabrielice being the same kind of mechanism that he was, but for these entirely self-interested, these entirely big evil structures, just on like a very personal level, to him resonates as the exact opposite of what he has spent most of his adult life doing.
Yeah, that's true. It kind of makes him similar to Windust in a way too, given the stuff from the last chapter's elucidation about his love for Giomara, but he's taken it a step further and is like actively being a counter-revolutionary or a counter insurgent for the forces that are kind of evil or working at a less than noble means. I think including that also provides some contrast to the additional details you get on Windust in the previous chapters.
Yeah, it makes me want to try to think about them as Pynchon loves doubling characters and having characters be very similar people in divergent or opposing situations. How do these three characters, who are with that reading of this section kind of framed as three sides of the same coin, how are they the same? How are they different? What does that very strange trinity, what does that mean for this book as a whole?
Yeah, it's a good question. One that I'll have to think about.
Yeah.
Given that I didn't come up with it until just now. So after that sort of like brief flashback, we get the full explanation of sort of the connection between Igor and Lester, and by sort of, I guess, transitive property, Misha and Grisha, in that the money that Lester was stealing from ICE was being diverted by Igor. So the money that he was stealing was the stuff that was all going to the like Wahhabist group, and then Igor was the person that he was using to kind of funnel it into his personal accounts or away from sort of where it was going to eventually go. And there's a moment of like real kind of punch you in the gut resonance where they describe Lester as like a little hedgehog in fog, only trying to find his friends, which really stands out amongst like the relative humor of this scenario of like Maxine and Talus Ice stuck in the back seat of this Russian limo while these two ne'er-do-wells are smoking blunts and
listening to Nelly.
And listening to Nelly as they talk about using an EMP device to go crash a server farm. There's just this brief moment of like really, really intense like sincerity of just like, yeah, Lester, he was just looking for some friends to help him out. Like he was not someone that needed to be caught up in all of this shit, and he was, and it went bad for him. And like, you can understand why Maxine and Igor and now Misha and Grisha have this like very kind of intense need to like find justice for him. It finally kind of fills in those last couple of pieces.
I didn't take hard notes on this research digression I went on, a few months ago now, but back when they mentioned like a bunch of Soviet directors, and I did those dives on their biographies. One of those is most famous for, and I can't even remember the name of it directing a movie that was an adaptation of a children's book. I want to say is called The Little Hedgehog. It's not called that though. So it's. I mean, I think it's very much a direct reference to a specific movie, and
I think that's the one that the Pynchon Wiki references, like Yoshik Vitumane. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but that's what they have listed. That's probably what it is. And it's not available on YouTube anymore, so that link doesn't work.
No. So they end up taking Talus and Maxine as far as Poughkeepsie, and in Poughkeepsie they drop them off at a train station, and so the two of them get into the train at almost 11 p.m. and head back to New York. Maxine, once again acting somewhat as a Yenta, says, "Go safe. Can't say I really approve. I know if my own kids ever got a hold of a..." and then they take off. The boys wave out the windows as they pull away. Do svidania, Maxi. Oka, Vevlik, Turva. I don't speak Russian. That translates to goodbye, Maxine. Bye, Ditzy Blonde. Which is just a really fun way to kind of close out the presence of those two characters in the book. And also probably seems kind of true about...
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other thoughts anyone had on chapter 40?
So yeah, I don't know how I missed that hedgehog in the fog note on the Pynchon Wiki, because one of the things I have to add to our discussion of this chapter is that I think that a lot of the things that the Pynchon Wiki mentions as this seems the one in particular that I think is interesting is on page 461. The Pynchon Wiki mentions that Jeff seems like a joke from Pynchon's part, because dope is not used in Russian that way, and there's another one like pokui is used, and they say, well, it's out of place here. It would make more sense if he was saying to hell with it. I think that's actually a little bit deeper. I think it actually might be basically we have these two guys who are super into Russian hip hop and are within that Fedonki subculture, which the Pynchon Wiki does explain quite as clearly as far as I'm aware. But they're also like two transplants from Russia who are spending a lot of time in New York. And if you're bilingual and you spend time with other people who are bilingual in a place where your first language is not your primary language, and you also love both American and Russian hip hop, you're just going to come up with your own kinds of slang within it's pigeon. That's what pigeons are. Them saying pokui, I don't think doesn't make sense. I think that is them being right in the time of Eminem saying we just don't give a fuck. I think it's character building. I think it's demonstrating that these two guys, as hard-edged as they are and as involved in organized crime, and as is said, they haven't actually spent time in prison. They've been to jail, but they aren't hard, tough guys. These are two nerds. They're two hacker nerds who have connections, but also like making stupid jokes and references and cross-lingual puns.
Yeah, they're like Eric Outfield, but a bit more put together in their stage presence.
Well, yeah, and more well connected for sure.
Yeah, that's also true.
But to I guess a slightly more serious thing, we have this the end of the conversation with March that leads to Maxine going to find Talus in her new apartment. We have the very what's the word I'm looking for? Haunting is not quite it, but I can't think of it, so whatever. Where basically March defines what an innocent person is as someone who is always underestimated by those around them. Mm-hmm. At least in that time, in that place. And so I do really, I want to know, first of all, what y'all think about that. on a surface level, but then also, what does that have to, how does that connect to the other very resonant line that Sean says, where all the dead are innocent, there are no innocent dead, along with, is all of this a game? Obviously, Gabriel Ice showing up in the next chapter, that's not made up, or at least it would be crazy to assume it were. But what is there a possibility that Talos is playing Maxine in some way, or that is all of this an act? Is she less oblivious than everyone thinks? Does she deserve to be cast as the Biela Curva, or is she a player as much as anyone else is in this grand scheme of espionage?
Yeah, that's where Talos is a really interesting character, because it's not, she is presented different ways at different times and is confident enough in each of those portrayals that it's hard to really gauge what she is. She plays the ditzy blonde very well. She plays the femme fatale very well. And it's implied when those scenes are happening that she is playing that character. She's not really that way, that she knows all of her little mannerisms are very calculated and very intentional. And so it's lending this idea of she is aware of what she's doing. But at the same time, later when we see her early conversations with Maxine, when she's kind of starting to put the pieces together about Ice, that maybe she doesn't really have the full picture the whole time. So I'm of the idea that she is playing herself as being more naive than she really is, until she realizes that she really is as naive as she's been playing herself out to be. And I think March's comment specifically about her innocence, I took that as coming from a more motherly stance of she sees Talos in a way that no one else can. Mm-hmm. She has that motherly vision of her daughter, and she knows deep down who her daughter really is. So all of the airs that she's playing, all of the impersonations, so to speak, that she's putting on, she sees through that. And I think that's where so much of her anger comes from at Talos, that she knows better than this, and she's a better person than this. That's a very frustrating thing as a parent to have to deal with, when you see your kid intentionally going under the bar, when you know they are fully capable of getting over it. It's maddening, because you want them to be their best person, and you know they're capable of doing that, but they're settling for so much less. So I think as the story has progressed, Talos has come to the realization that she doesn't know way more than she thought she didn't know. And as she puts the pieces together, that facade of playing the femme fatale or the ditzy blonde has just completely crumbled on her and put her into the position she's in. So it's really backfired on her in a way that she couldn't have foreseen. I think that's what makes the reunion with her and March so much more impactful, is that you have, March, who has been calling this all along, and Talos, who has been, I don't want to say denying it, but certainly playing as though she's not aware of it. And then, these two worlds can finally hit, and they can finally be the mother and daughter that they both wanted each other to be. It just took all of this time and all of these events to get to that point.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with Cody in the sense that I think a lot of this comes from the motherly instinct, especially because of the fact that when we see Talos now, as opposed to how she was when Maxine went to go visit Ice's apartment, she's no longer putting on that act, right? It's almost as if March is sort of saying, like, my real daughter is very innocent. I don't know what the hell this thing is that she's been pretending to be for so long. But like the person I know is in there is certainly an innocent individual. And when you see Talos this time, she's very, very different from how she was prior. and doesn't do the lilting thing, doesn't do the I don't know what you're talking about, I'm so stupid thing. Like she's
twisting her pinky on her mouth and all that bullshit.
Yeah, exactly. She comes across as like a completely different individual as opposed to what Maxine sort of interacted with prior. I think that's where a lot of that comes from, because I think that if Gabriel Ice's wife was not March's daughter, she would not have any sympathy for the wife of Gabriel Ice.
No.
I'm pretty sure she would actually be more angry at her for not leaving him for being evil than she would be, given that it's her own child.
I think that those interpretations of March's intentions make a lot of sense, and I don't have anything to add on to it. But I do have one more thing to jump back to. Way back when Dieter was introduced as Gabriel Ice's roommate, I believe I mentioned that, hey, this is the same name as the character who was the former, I think, a Dutch soldier who was at St. Helena and was essentially haunting Maskelyne.
Yes.
And I jumped back to look at his first appearance, and I think when I mentioned that, I basically said, well, if anyone has any ideas, please reach out. With Dieter coming back here, I do want to say, I think it makes a lot of sense to look at Dieter being a bagpipist is somebody who is, in this context, is playing dirges at funerals and stuff. And back in the context of Mason and Dixon, Dieter, this probably a different character, is kind of an icon of the insanity that Maskelyne is being driven to by the wind and the isolation of St. Helena on the far side of the island from the settlement.
Mm-hmm.
Dieter he was the reason that Gabriel Ice spent so much time learning about computers, is to stay away from his roommate who was blowing his ears out. And now he's somebody who is presented as, I think in Maxine's words, a forward indicator, a leading indicator. And I wonder what that can be brought into, I don't know, as interpretation, or what these people like Gabriel Ice, what these people like Neville Maskelyne are in this alternate history of the world as is portrayed in these novels.
I think most likely they're what they kind of mean or refer to are sort of change agents or people who are fulcrums of change, right? Maskelyne obviously becomes the royal astronomer, and they have their whole like dust up between him and Mason later in the book, and there's that sort of like constant tension between them, and obviously the real Maskelyne and did a lot of important work like in the actual history. Also, sent Mason to go and do his observations at the end. He seems almost like he was kind of Mason was kind of fueled by that rivalry in a certain degree, which leads to some of the discoveries that he made or big things that he did. And then you have someone like Ice, who, in this alternate history of the world, is partially responsible for 9/11. Deals with kind of the expanding security apparatus and bringing it forward into this sort of online thing where that's where everyone's just sort of stuck now as a way of communication or as a way of control or all of that. So that's the closest thing that I see between the two of them, is that both of them may be sort of seen as change agents or fulcrums upon which different eras pivot.
Or and to add on to that, maybe even like more specifically, the specific way that they're fulcra of change might be like as the people who set the bounds by which modernity, in the context of Neville Maskelyne, as Wikipedia says, the first person to scientifically measure the mass of the planet Earth, and the person who set out the way to actually find, was it longitude at sea?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, sounds right.
Yeah, Maskelyne, the person who sets those terms for thinking of the domain of human life. And in this case, Gabriel Ice is, while a pretty direct stand-in for Joshua Harris, more generally, he's like a stand-in for these tech founders. They are the people setting the terms of debate.
Mhm.
They might not be all that knowing. They might not be all that conspiratorial or evil necessarily. Like clearly, Gabriel Ice is basically evil.
Yeah.
Neville Maskelyne is not necessarily evil. They're both in a way born into their opportunity to set these terms,
Mhm.
and the way that the way that they are, put into those positions also determines how they set those terms, which is the basis on which everyone else builds the political and social points of debate.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can, I think, even take it a bit further and say that even if you're just looking at Josh Harris specifically as the historical character that he's based upon, rather than like the tech guys as a whole, I think it still works because Josh Harris was the only guy out of that whole tech boom thing that predicted where things would be at rather than where they were. Like Rocketfish succeeded because they had the ability to make websites for companies, right? That isn't predictive. That's prescriptive to the time you're living. But like Josh Harris was too far ahead of the curve to be successful because Pseudo was just YouTube, but it had the live streaming component already built into it. And then, like, the first iteration of We Live in Public, when it was this recorded thing that, dozens of people were a part of, that was also sort of a forerunner to YouTube or to Twitch or to anything like that. And then finally, when he moved We Live in Public into his own house with his girlfriend, then it became basically the forerunner for Justin TV, which eventually would become Twitch, because Justin TV was just a guy named Justin live streaming himself in his apartment, and that's all that Josh Harris was doing with his wife, or his girlfriend at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that he talked about these systems and the way that he talked about their importance has led to the reality that we live in now. Like it's a shame that not enough people know about him, because I feel like a lot of the stuff that he talked about happening as it relates to like, we are all going to live in public and we're going to want that to happen. We're going to ask that to happen to us because of the convenience that it offers or because of the opportunity of fame that it offers or whatever. That character on its own is enough of a forerunner to an understanding of how human life was going to change in relation to the living spaces that we were in. Where suddenly, like, where you live isn't just where you live anymore. It's a place that you can make money off of by taking photos of your dog or by live streaming yourself. Being in public is the same thing. It's not just being in public anymore, but that like public square, that like place that people live. It is also the idea that that is also monetizable or that is also usable for content in some way that it wasn't before. So his predictions as a tech guy did kind of provide a forerunning or foretaste of an understanding of where, what it means to be alive on the planet Earth in the 21st century would end up meaning.
Yeah, it's definitely true.
But those are good questions. Like I wouldn't have connected necessarily Maskelyne and Ice together, but especially with the mention of Peter being there for both of them, it does make me wonder what Pynchon is up to.
Well, and it also, I think there's a rough but strong analogy between the noise of the wind / the bagpipes and the heat that this whole chapter is like motif wise pounding into our heads from Lake Heat Sink to the cooling fins on the condo tower radiating wealth to just Gabriel Ice in general wanting to move to the Arctic. I think there's probably some thermodynamic interpretation of that analogy.
Yeah, as usual, if you're out there listening and you have some sort of way to put those things together, please let us know. All right, so 41 opens on the train all the way back from Poughkeepsie. They've both fallen asleep as they've gone back home, and they finally, once they get back in the city, Talos thinks that maybe the apartment is safe by that point, instead of it actually being safe, they show up and it turns out that Chaz, her side piece, is there waiting for her, watching an Elvis movie. And I really love the constant motif of him changing what type of a sweetener he's going to refer
Artificial
to her by.
sweet.
Yeah, saying NutraSweet, artificial sweetener, just like constantly changing what it is because she doesn't want to be called sugar. It turns out that like he did start out by working for ICE, but I actually fell in love with you and I don't work for him anymore. Do we believe him? I don't think I have any reason to believe that he's telling the
I
truth.
don't. I
Conversation.
don't at all.
No.
Honestly, I kind of do believe him, just because the kind of guy who hears "Don't call me sugar" and replaces it with NutraSweet. Like, I think there's a certain kind of guy that thinks that is a convincing thing to say, like, look, yeah, I was hired to be your to fake being the person you were cheating with, but I really fell in love with you. I think the kind of person who would say that sincerely would also call this person who he's trying to endear himself to artificial sweetener. I'm sold on it. I think he seems really dumb and very close-minded in a way that he would believe that he is in love with her and that she would ever believe it, and that pitching it that way would actually come across as genuine.
Yeah, see, I want to believe you, but then when he gets to the quote on 465 where he says, "Real and make-believe's all I ever meant. My artificial sweetener, I'm just a logistics and infrastructure type fella. Fiber's real, you pull it through conduit, you hang it, you bury it, and splice it. It weighs something. Your husband's rich, maybe even smart, but he's like all you people, living in this dream up in the clouds, floating in the bubble, thinking that's real. Think again. It's only going to be there long as the power's on. What happens when the grid goes dark? Generator fuel runs out and they shoot down satellites, bomb the operation centers, and you're all back down on planet Earth again. All that jabbering about nothing, all that shit music, all them links down and gone." See, that's a very smart like interpretation of like the non-reality of the internet spaces, and how like if it does go away, it isn't anything tangible, but like the fiber optic cable that services does. So he's got to be he's got to be at least somewhat smarter than just a complete like rube.
Yeah, I think he's smart from a business perspective, and it's because of that particular bit of dialogue that you put, because that's very much that. And I believe he is Texan, if I'm not mistaken. He's like North Texan or something.
Somewhere down in the U.S., I think, is all we got.
Okay.
Tallis refers to him as East Texan, which is like a dick with a accent or something like that. Is what she says. Yeah.
This reads like an oil tycoon who doesn't know how to talk to people, but he knows business and how business works. So he gets exactly like what Kate was saying. Like, he gets that the internet is this, bizarre. Like, we're basically paying for dreams and ideas, and it's stupid. There's nothing tangible there, but we're willing to fork over tons of money for it. So he's very smart on that end. Has as much charisma as a stale loaf of bread, and so that's where I don't believe him when he's trying to talk about how like he's done with it and all that kind of. I don't believe that for a second, because he's a fucking snake oil salesman.
Well, I guess my thing is that he isn't a snake oil salesman. He's an opportunist.
There you go. That's a better way of phrasing it.
Yeah, but like, to your point, he's this. I've met guys just like this. I mean, he's this kind of dude who thinks that if he can see it and touch it, then it's real, and anything more abstract isn't. And those are the kinds of people who are smart enough to succeed, but not ever smart enough to ever set the terms for the next game, if that makes sense. They can win a game of poker, but they're not ever going to be the dealer. They're not ever going to be the house. And he's this kind of guy who's going through life thinking he understands it all, which is why he goes on this long rant that might be accurate in a meaningful sense. But just because, if the power goes out, where's all that internet going? Just
Mhm.
even though that's true, that doesn't mean that that's not where banks have their money, right? It doesn't mean that that is what substantiates the value of the fiber optic cable that he sells.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, I don't know. Not that even I think that these are not that I'm going back to my constant refrain of two perspectives on the same thing. I just also, that doesn't convince me, because it just does seem like exactly the kind of rube who would call someone artificial sweetener would think he's still not necessarily getting one over on Talus, but think that, well, I'm being honest about my thoughts about this, so of course she's gonna think I'm being honest about my feelings for her.
Sure,
And,
I gotcha.
Yeah.
less in a conniving way, and more in a he is the one being played kind of angle.
Yeah. So he's affecting the oh shucks farmer. Oops.
Well, not even oh shucks farmer, but like this is his honesty. This is, for him, he sees everyone else as too smart for their own good. You spend all your time in college getting educated, and you think that the books are more real than the money in your hand. That kind of thing.
Yeah, I got
Yeah.
Interesting character. Also, another case of a character that was initially brought up hundreds of pages ago.
Yeah.
When Maxine was talking about the Dixieland Mafia, and only just now re-enters the page in like a meaningful way. So Talus doesn't really buy it, regardless of what we all may think about Chaz's offer, and so they decide instead to to leave and sort of meet up with March, but isn't before Maxine goes home, and we get another case of one of these fake biopics. This time, the Anton Chekhov story, starring Edward Norton with Peter Sarsgaard as Stanislavski, which is an interesting one, probably the most interesting one so far. I don't know if Chekhov lived a dramatic life, but for some reason in my head, I just feel like there wouldn't be much going on in that biopic. And this is where we get another case of, again, I'm pretty sure Horst was an abusive husband, and his reaction to her coming home is certainly a signpost of that, where he says, right, and she hasn't had the telephone put in yet, so what about your mobile? Oh, the battery ran down, I bet. Horst, what's the matter? Who is it, Maxie? I'd rather hear it now rather than later. Just immediately going to that whole thing of just like, you need to prove to me right now that you are not cheating on me. That's very controlling, abusive sort of partner stuff. And eventually, the way that Maxine kind of gets out of it, though, is, again, one of these moments where, like the story about Horst choking her, I just want to like grab her and be like, Maxine, please, you're so nice, you're so sweet to people. Like, you don't
so
have
much better than this.
Yeah, you don't have to put up with this. Like when she basically just said, as a way to like head off his sort of like evil inquiry, she just goes, well, like, if you want to go do karaoke together, we can. Like, she heads off his complaint at the past, and like, I'll wear the red dress you're so worried about. Like, it's just such it's a case where she's looking at what the feelings may be internally there, rather than the way that it's being produced or thrown back at her, and is like meeting that feeling of inadequacy or that concern. And when I'm reading through this, I'm like, he's not worth it, Maxine.
No.
This person is not worth it. He's blaming you for his overeating while complaining. Like,
there's a huge difference between someone who's just emotionally insecure and thinks that she's leaving him alone because she doesn't want to be with him or whatever the case may be. Not saying that is acceptable behavior. That is just different than someone who is also physically and emotionally abusive, which Horst is, as we have seen earlier. So that's where it's really frustrating, because I get what she's trying to do. I get that she's trying to fix him, and that she's invested so much into him that she feels like she needs to make it work and she needs to justify it. But she even has the moment where she snaps at him and she says, there is nobody but you, Horst, emotionally fucking challenged ox. Never
Yeah.
will be. Like she sees what it is, and that's what's frustrating. And this goes back. This is how Marge Kelleher sees Tallis.
Mhm.
As the reader, I see Maxine like that. Like, you can do so much better. You don't deserve to be treated like this. You're better than that. Just leave.
Mhm.
Just fucking leave. As that. Your kids are old enough. They'll work through it. They'll get over it. It'll be better for everybody if you just get out of it. But she doesn't. She just keeps trying to fix it and trying to justify staying with him, and it's so maddening.
Yeah, it really is.
Well, on top of the, no, but like, in the line of what you just said, Cody, like, yeah, nobody deserves to feel like they need to be in a relationship with someone who's so emotionally insecure that they go on this kind of downward spiral of panic. But it, even beyond the line between physical abuse and emotional abuse and just insecurity, there's the fact that right there, right at that moment where she delivers that line, he goes on to, while he doesn't go, as is phrased, totally into Midwest Ricky Ricardo, which is a great line, by the way. He immediately jumps to, like, what are you doing with Uncle Dizzy's home number? Like, he's not just insecure about how much she wants to be with him or how much she doesn't want to be with him. He's not just insecure about, like, the idea of her cheating. He is so enraged that he's just like, why do you have this guy's phone number on your Rolodex?
Yeah.
Like, that is really, I think, the dividing line between insecurity and abuse is he's not willing to say, well, fuck, I overreacted. He's saying, he's dressing her down for running a business and having personal connections to people.
Yeah. I was gonna bring this up later, when we had the scene with Gabriel Ice, but it's something that I found interesting about this book that I didn't really realize until the end is, in regards to the antagonist of this, it's set up and presented as Gabriel Ice being the primary antagonist. And I think that's generally the case because his actions impact more characters and more parts of the plot than anybody else. But I think Horst is a secondary antagonist. He is very much the driving force behind what keeps Maxine from being able to fully meet her potential. He's the one holding her back throughout the whole story. He is constantly in her way. And I mean, he's just, the way he treats her, the way he interrupts her life, he is a secondary antagonist.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like the way that he re-enters her life is like kind of insidious. Like,
yeah. He just inserts himself into the shower while she's in there.
Yeah, and like Maxine never like invites him to stay. It's only after he like forces his way into the apartment like repeatedly. Like he makes the suggestion of like, well, why don't I stay here? And she doesn't say she'd be okay with it. She says the kids would probably like it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're looking back at this relationship, the way that kind of we came to the conclusion of as we read the book, that like he was likely physically and emotionally abusive repeatedly, she probably knows that if she says no, that is going to incur a very negative, like wrathful response from him in that moment. So of course she's not going to say no. She's going to come up with something else to say. Like, Horst is not a good guy.
No, not by any means.
And I think almost there is some degree to which Horst and Gabriel Ice, if we're talking about like characters being multiple characters, like characters being, mirrors of each other, there's a relationship there too between the way that they treat their partners. It's just one has the cachet and resources and political power to like erase his wife's identity, and one of them just has the ability to like make her life miserable. Like, but both affect the same evil on the other person.
This is not ameliorating what I'm going to go into, but I do think there is a difference in the characters there, because yeah, absolutely, in the sense that they are both symbolic of abusive partners, then very much so. I would say though that I don't think that Horst's Midwestern Ricky Ricardo, I don't think it would be the same kind of abuse. were Maxine to push back at any of those points. I think what I like so much about the way that this relationship is drawn is that as much as you can read it as Maxine is in denial about how she feels about Horst, I don't think that's quite it either. I think what instead is happening is something much sadder, in that this is somebody who, not necessarily Maxine thinks she believes or she deserves this, but that Maxine is okay with the thin end of the wedge. Not in even like a, oh, well, I can deal with it sense, but in the idea that she likes having him around in those terms, and that Horst is not, he is absolutely an antagonist to Maxine in that character framing. But he's not the antagonist of the story because he's not a villain. He's not an evil person. I don't think he's aware of any of these dynamics. I don't think that if he felt like his control over Maxine was threatened, he would respond the same specific way that Gabrielice does. And that, again, that's not to say that he's better, but it is different. And I love the way that this relationship is drawn. As much as I hate the relationship, and as much as I completely agree, Maxine deserves better. I do think, though, that it's very rare to find such a subtly accurate portrayal of what an actually abusive relationship looks like.
Yeah,
because there's not a villain in 99% of those stories. There might be one person who is the abuser, clear cut, undeniably so, like in this case. But that doesn't mean that Horst is evil. That doesn't mean that Horst is ever thinking about these things in the terms of controlling her. He is such a laconic presence. He is just this guy who sits and eats ice cream and watches TV. And he probably was genuinely worried about Maxine. But that doesn't make any of this horrible manipulation that is going on in this scene, as unconscious as it may or may not be, it doesn't make it better.
Mm-hmm.
It just makes it more real and more sad, because with Gabrielice, you can say this is an evil person. There are plenty of people in real life who are abusive who you can say this is an evil person. Horst is not evil. He's just wrong and abusive.
He's just an asshole. Yeah.
Yeah, very, very. You took the next words that I was going to say out of my mouth, Will, from a standpoint of just like, it is very impressive how realistic all of this is. It's just, it makes me wonder, was Pynchon in a relationship like this, or does he just know a lot of girls who are like, I can fix him girlies? Like, I don't know. I want to know where he got that from.
It seems like I'm sure he's been around people who have been in a relationship like that.
Yeah.
On whatever end of it, but it's written in such a way, like Will was saying, it's written in such a way that I think he definitely has some experience with it. How close he was to it, who knows? But he definitely is aware of these types of people and how they act.
Yeah, that's
well. And I mean, I really don't want to come across like I'm alleging anything. I don't know any. I don't, don't know anything.
No.
But I feel like Horst is like the flip side of Ernie in a lot of ways, where Ernie is maybe not the best husband. It really seems like both Ernie and Elaine do love each other and did, keep a relatively non-abusive household in raising their daughters. But Horst and Ernie are superficially very similar characters. And I get the sense that a lot of what we see in Horst is a lot of Pynchon reflecting on himself as a younger man. And maybe he was never physically abusive. Maybe he was never anywhere near as bad as Horst can be here. But I think that there's a lot of Pynchon to be seen in the way that Horst is written, or at least how Pynchon views himself, or viewed himself as a younger man.
Sure.
And we again, I'm not saying anything. We don't know anything about Pynchon's personal life, really. We know that he might have stolen someone's girlfriend. But that's really about it. We know that he settled down with his editor and had a kid. That is about as much
That's
as
the
we
extent
know.
of it. Yeah.
And I think it's very possible that this depiction of Horst is in some way a mea culpa of saying, I was a shitty person when I was younger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, kind of reminds me of Wallace in that regard. That once he got married, he was like, "Oh, I was like a deeply neurotic, like a kind of abusive individual when I was younger, and I need to very intentionally not be that way anymore." Yeah, that's a good point. Oh, I mean, but by the way, you missed out the fact that we know what Thomas Pynchon's entire daily routine is, because that's the trailer for this book as it was published on Penguin's YouTube page.
Oh, really? I actually don't know anything about this.
You haven't seen that? Yeah, Penguin did a trailer for this book where they hired a guy wearing a T-shirt that says "I'm Tom Pynchon," and he does like a comedic like daily routine thing where he goes to like Zabar's and he does a bunch of other stuff, and then it ends with him being kind of interviewed on a park bench before putting smoked salmon on his face as moisturizer.
I'd forgotten about that. I need to go back and watch that again.
Smoked salmon sounds like a horrible face mask.
Yeah, well, it's the type of smoked salmon where it's lox, so it's really wet.
I mean, still. Well, I look forward to watching this. It'll at very least probably be fairly funny.
It's interesting. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, that's as I remember it. It's an experience.
It really makes me wonder how and why and who wrote the script for it.
Mm-hmm.
Any other thoughts on Horst before we move on?
I guess all I have is that I think it's hilarious that it's at least framed as that he takes for granted that everyone knows that he knows how to sing harmony.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Just like another weird level of unawareness in him.
Mm-hmm. We are then told that the Lester Tripes Memorial Pulse does happen. Misha and Grisha do indeed shut down the server for a little bit, but it doesn't really make the news, doesn't really make waves at all. Avi comes home from work one day and mentions that it wasn't a big deal because they just immediately switched the server they were running off of to the one in Lapland instead of the one out there at the Lake Heatsink. And then he also mentions the fact that they're probably going to fire him. And he's pretty excited about that because that means he's going to get like a big old compensation package. But Maxine tells him to watch out for any closet rooms. He can't talk about his time there. Then we go to a very Pynchon-esque tableau of lunch between March, Maxine, and Talus, in which they decide to kind of reunite and reconcile, and they call a place called Zippy's Appetizer. Which is just what a name for a restaurant.
Yeah.
I don't really have any desire to open my own restaurant, but I think if I did, I'd have to call it Zippy's Appetizer. You want to see her more than anything? Look, you're just nervous, March. Why don't both of you come over to my place? Neutral corner, we'll have coffee, order in lunch. As it turns out from Zippy's Appetizing down in 72nd, where a person can still find, for example, a gigantically overstuffed rolled beef and chicken liver sandwich with Russian dressing on an onion roll. A rarity in this town since deep in the last century. In on the paragraph allotted it by the takeout menu, Talus instantly zooms. You would actually eat something like that? I love that it gets a paragraph on the menu just for this one food item. And then there's this great back and forth here that made me laugh so hard. I scared my dog. And literally, it's just, you would actually eat something like that? March, despite a warning glance from Maxine. Well, no, mother. I thought I'd just sit and gaze at it for a while. Would that be all right? March, thinking fast. Only that if you do get one, maybe I could try a small piece of it, only if you could spare. How long you been Jewish? Maxine out the side of her mouth. It's such a good joke. To which Talus mentions that in history past, when March would order food, a small crew of delivery kids would show up. And then finally, we get the depiction of their actual meal, which is just so crazy. they're trying to figure out how to split the check. And it says here, competitive math, mistakes real and tactical, figuring out the tip and how to divide up the sales tax go on until Rigoberto buzzes up. It turns out to be only one delivery kid, but he does seem to be wheeling the food down the hall in a dolly of some kind. Presently, the entire surface of the table in the dining room is covered with containers, soda cans, waxed paper, plastic wrap, and sandwiches and side orders, and everybody is intensely pressing without regard to where. Besides into mouths, it's all going. Maxine takes a short break to observe March, and then she opens up another container of coleslaw after speaking clearly with a bunch of food in her mouth. At another point here, Maxine puts an entirely overlooked pickle into her mouth. It's just a crazy feast of all this crazy amount of food that they order. But it's all sort of done to talk about the fact that Callus is not interested in the money, which does, I think, provoke a real sense of pride in March based on her response to that, and is just interested in getting custody of their son Kennedy, and sort of the beginning of their reconciliation as a couple, as a mother-daughter couple begins here, as they just eat what is truly an ungodly amount of food.
At least it's good food, though.
Do you think the sandwich as described sounds good?
I say good in the sense of what we typically get in Pynchon novels.
Wait,
it's edible.
Which sandwich are we talking about?
The rolled
beef,
the rolled beef and chicken liver with Russian dressing on an onion roll.
Oh,
it's edible.
That sounds delicious.
Does it?
I don't think so.
I'd eat the hell out of that. It sounds great.
It's not the Mason and Dixon pizza. It's not the Gravity's Rainbow Jelly Beans. It's edible food. So
yeah, I think Pynchon has a vested interest in making you think that the cuisine in New York is good. Yeah. So after their quite frankly insane meal, they decide that they're gonna leave the house and go out, but Maxine calls Horst and says that it's going to be a girls' night, which again Horst responds and says, "Did I ask?" Like, it's just it's and then she says, "You're improving." No, he's not, Maxine.
Yeah.
That response is not a better response.
Well, but that is the thing. That's why he's not evil. She's just like his perfect abuse victim.
Yeah.
She thinks that it's improving, that she told him in advance, when that's not improvement.
No.
Get out.
Get out of there, Maxine, please, for the love of God. She asks to borrow his car, which he agrees to, and they go out onto the street, but aren't there for very long before who should show up but Gabriel Ice in a snow white stretch limo that has a hashtag, which is the Hashslingers logo on it, painted on the roof, and a bunch of personal satellite links. So presumably there's a satellite dish off the roof as well, which, what a clown car that is.
It really is.
Like, every time this guy shows up, it is so painfully clear that he does not know anything about money or what station he's at in life at all.
He's just aping what he saw on movies and TV.
Yeah, it's like something out of Dallas. Actually, isn't there someone on Dallas who has like a stretch white limousine?
I think there is.
He's
probably just. It sounds like the car that the record executive in Wayne's World drove around in.
Right. He immediately gets out of his ridiculous vehicle, and as soon as he does so, Maxine is returning from picking out the Impala from Warp Speed parking just around the corner, and March is saying that she's going to kill him, just immediately, just on sight. Just there he is. I'm going to kill him. And then Talus is being very calm, like speaking to him in a way that is going to, be the best to hold up in court from a standpoint of, I have witnesses of you being crazy. I'm not doing anything else. And it's just saying, like, yeah, you need a doctor, Gabe. You need a doctor, because this is the way you're behaving is great. he's threatening to basically never give up custody of the kid, and how she's not going to get anything. Again, very insane behavior for someone who is divorcing his wife, not the other way around. And then there's this quote here that says, after Tao says, it's a lawyer you gave, it's a doctor. Then it says, she means mentally, but at this point, Gabe isn't looking too fit either. His face all red and swollen, some trembling he can't control. And then, listen to me, bitch, I'll buy as many judges as I need to, but you'll never see my son again. Fucking never. I highlighted that section here specifically because of the description of what he looks like now. It really reminds me of when they finally find Kurtz in Heart of Darkness, and he's become like a skeleton, basically, like a living skeleton. He's just like clutching these pieces of ivory. And in the way that book showcases the way that colonial projects and colonialism cuts both against the colonized and the colonizer, and how Kurtz has like emptied out his humanity in this quest for ivory as part of this colonial project. I think there's a similar thing going on with Gabriel Ice here, where he just gets, each time we hear him described, first it's like kind of goofy, and then other times he's holding court, but then like when you see him after the thing that he's been working towards for so long, this like big project that he was picked for, finally worked, finally went off without a hitch, the towers are gone, he has control of Deep Archer, he's got control of like everything now. He's like physically degenerating, except he's getting, fatter, which either could be due to alcoholism, that would explain the red face as well, or some substance abuse or something like that. I think it's one of these moments where it's a really clever way of Pynchon being like, yeah, the way this person is physically is a depiction of just how bad they are, like, inside.
Yeah.
Well, I think y'all mentioned at some point, I've tried to stay away, consciously tried to stay away from digging more into Josh Harris, because it feels like, somebody should be grounded away from that very clear, intentional allusion. But you had mentioned something about, at some point, him using like bath salts, or maybe not, maybe I'm just misremembering. Anyway, it doesn't matter, because part of the reason I haven't dug into him is to stop from conflating Gabriel Ice with Josh Harris. But who this is a lot like, and I mentioned Ketone because he showed up the character last section. And long ago, in the beginning of this book, I mentioned that he would exist, and the reason for that was because Gabriel Ice was on the phone acting exactly like a stimulant addict would. Mm-hmm. And, I think the red swollen face is more of an alcohol thing than any bath salt would. But it does remind me of like John McAfee and his insane abuse of various cathinones, which are ketone substituted amphetamines, and how all of this kind of lines up for me as like an indication of Pynchon at least saying, look, these people they're not on cocaine anymore, they're on this crazier shit that's even worse for you.
Mm-hmm.
Because yeah, absolutely, on like in that same Heart of Darkness way, this is the Kurtz being nothing but skin and bones, but it is also more materially people like John McAfee, and like, people make a big deal about like, oh, Elon Musk is using all these drugs. And yeah, this hacker subculture is full of people who take these research chemicals like candy.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely, yeah. And I mean, if you want to talk about like allusions between like the Nazis and something like this, because the Pynchon wiki does mention that like if you just slightly change how a hashtag is oriented, it could look like the like lightning bolts of the SS. The Nazis were all on meth as a big part of what they did to fuel their like regime of evil. So there's also some historical precedent for people at this caliber of like influence and wrongdoing to be into crazy research chemicals or high powered stimulants like that. But speaking of Josh Harris, there is a moment here where after Maxine points the gun at him, he raises a hand, Taos avoids easily, but the Tomcat is now in the equation. It doesn't happen. Ice carefully watching the muzzle. How's that, Gabe? I don't die. There's no scenario where I die. this is exactly something that Josh Harris says. He says it on video in the We Live in Public documentary, where he says, "There's no way that I'm taken before my time." He had this belief that he was like important, and what he was doing was important, and that particular quote has never been fully elucidated. Like he's never provided like a further explanation of why he said that or what he meant. But again, Josh Harris is like a weird guy. There's a lot of like weird stuff going on there with like him having a CIA therapist and his dad being a CIA agent in Ethiopia for most of his life, and like the stuff with the World Trade Center and Gelatin, the art collective that he worked with. And it's he is a very strange man who would say something like that. But I think the other thing to kind of like bring it not just from the illusion of Josh Harris, but also into this book, right, is that even if Gabriel Ice does die, like let's say Maxine does shoot him in the forehead, which in which case, you know, this would be more so a Philip Marlowe novel if that happened, then he still doesn't die because the World Trade Center has still fallen. The towers are still gone. The world that ushered in is still here. That doesn't erase that. And he may still be alive in Deep Archer, just like, you know, the other people who are dead that Maxine runs into down there are. You are now living in an age that was came to fruition with the aid of Gabriel Ice. You can't get rid of him in the same way that, you know, Osama bin Laden you can't get rid of, right? Like we killed him if you believe that he was killed in that raid. Some people don't, but that does not erase Al Qaeda, the organization he started. That does not erase the fact that he was involved in the planning of the attacks on the Twin Towers. That doesn't erase all of the resources and blood and treasure and human lives that were expended to go over there to institute the shock doctrine in the Middle East over there. You can't get rid of it. And I think that that's more so potentially what Pynchon is talking about there. And maybe that is what Josh Harris was talking about. That he will not go before his time in the sense that he is creating the future, whether it was with his project Quiet or his project We Live in Public. And his influence is not going to go until that goes. And who knows when that's going to be.
Yeah, and in the slightly more defocused analogy thing, if it wasn't Gabriel Ice, if it wasn't Joshua Harris, it would be somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
He can die. Even you go back in time, you kill Hitler, someone else is going to maybe not do the exact same thing. These same forces are still going to get to the same kinds of horrors. If it wasn't Josh Harris, someone else would have maybe not streamed their abusive relationship with their partner, but would have been saying the same kinds of things. If it weren't for Gabriel Ice, someone else would be like, we should really be going to the Arctic. That's where it's so cold that we don't have to pay any money on AC.
Right. Yeah. And
then in the very focused non-analogy, that's exactly what I was referring to with like the kind of stuff that a stimulant addict says.
Mm-hmm.
That's stimulant psychosis textbook right there, is somebody who's like, you can shoot me in the head and I'll just keep on going because I've never died before.
Yeah, very, very true. I have seen some people on stimulants. That is how they behave. Eventually, this whole thing kind of calms down. Gabriel Ice goes back to his car. I love March's last sort of parting words that she screams at him. Does someone want to read that quote on 474?
She forgot the part, March can't help hollering out the window, where you don't get to be master of the universe. You go on being a schmuck. All kinds of competition starts coming out of the woodwork, and you have to scramble to not lose market share, and your life stops being your own and belongs to the overlords you always worshipped.
I love that part.
Yeah, it's great. It's also it's kind of the epitome of the issues that March has with her interpretation of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Shouting that at Gabriel Ice is not going to convince him. It's also not even going to sting for him. He's not going to take it as an insult. He's just going to hear it as a bunch of gibberish.
But it feels good for her.
Yeah.
It's cathartic for her.
Yeah. And in this context, that's totally justified.
Yeah. After that, they part ways, and then they kind of just take the Impala on an aimless drive until eventually they end up back at the Warp Speed parking garage, and Maxine takes it down, and the three of them rather, just sort of find a place to park for. and they talk about what happens. I like the quote again where it refers after they start smoking weed. I think is even kind of funnier. Like they start passing a joint back and forth in this Impala in a parking garage, and then eventually one of them says, "You heard what he said. I think this is in his contract with the Death Lords he works for. He's protected. He walked away from a loaded handgun. That's all. He'll be back. Nothing's over." And then Talos is worried once again about the kid, but it just there's no percentage in Gabriel is taking this kid. He has other stuff that he's more worried about.
Yeah, it's
he's
just
constantly not home. Yeah, exactly. He's not going to take care of Kennedy even if he was a kid. And they talk about whether or not he might actually genuinely pack up and go for someplace like Antarctica because that's where he seems to want to be. And then the three of them sort of just fall asleep in the car together. And then they wake up the next morning. They head upstairs from the parking garage and out into the street. And this is where we get again that allusion back to the very beginning of the book, sort of the completion of this like cycle, or this year. That's sort of the exact amount of time this book runs for, where she notices that the pear trees are in bloom again, and then she goes up to get ready to take the kids to school because she realizes that she's way overslept, and that's when she realizes that the kids are old enough to where they don't need to be walked to school anymore. That's the end of the book. Quite a novel.
What a novel. What an ending.
Uh-huh.
I'm happy that Maxine has this ending. All of my issues with her and Horst aside, I'm happy that she has this. And I get the feeling, especially with scenes like this and earlier scenes as well, that a lot of the reason, and I, again, am not justifying in any way, shape, or form her willingness to stay with Horst, but I get the feeling a lot of it is just to protect her kids and to make sure that they don't go through the trauma of their parents getting divorced.
Oh, I'm sure.
And it warms my heart to see how much she cares about her kids. And as a parent, again, this is hard. Like this idea of just letting your kids go. Like I remember the first day I took my son, because he's the older of my two. First day we took him to school and like dropped him off. Like I remember driving there and trying to like psych myself up and like, oh, I'm not gonna, this isn't gonna be a big deal because if I make a big deal, then he's gonna make a big deal, and but I fucking broke down. Like it's just impossible to not do that. Like you have that faith in you that your kids are going to do the right thing and they're going to be good and they're going to be okay and they're going to be safe, but that letting go is almost indescribably hard to do. And this final moment with Maxine, especially just the Ziggy surprising her with an unsolicited air kiss. See you later at pickup, okay? Give me a second, I'll be right with you. It's all right, Mom, we're good. I know you are, Zig. That's the trouble. That's where I just absolutely lost it. Just that line absolutely wrecked me.
Yeah, it's hard to read. I don't even have kids, but like he's done such a good job of like illustrating where she's at in her life at this like transitional state where she's like kind of middle age, not fully into middle age yet, like is settled into being a mom. Probably isn't gonna have any other kids, right? But he does these different moments where like between her fear of becoming a Yenta, where there's these other small moments. Like there's one when they briefly stay with Ernie after the whole Krav Maga incident, where she goes and checks in on them and appreciates that they've left the door open for her because soon enough they're going to be old enough to where she has to knock instead of just being able to look in on them. And it's stuff like that where it's like,
yeah,
like it's just so sad.
Yeah.
Most direct comparison to another one of Pynchon's books is in this scene is Mason and Dixon's ending, where you don't have Charles Mason waving off his kids because he's died. But what you do have is this beautiful optimism where his sons are saying, look, we heard all these amazing stories from our dad. We heard what America can be. Let's go build it. Let's go be part of that. And so they do. And 300 years later, almost not 300, about 220 or something years later, you have somebody who, while not related to Charles Mason, these people, these kids who are clearly like as precocious as any of his children would have been, these kids who are the kinds of kids who build their own idyllic version of Manhattan. And they're so sure of themselves. And Maxine and the readers and Pynchon, we all know that you don't get to go fishing for stars. You don't get to make a better world. Not that way, at least. But you know that you did the best you can, and the kids are going to be the kids. And you trust the kids. You're afraid for them. And it's so beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
It is so hopeful. And at the same time, so resigned. So painfully hopeful.
Yeah, I agree. Beautiful book. Love this book so much. Well, any funny parts that we didn't go through as we went through the read?
We covered everything I had.
In those last 2 pages, we skipped over the Fatty Arbuckle story starring Leonardo DiCaprio.
Yeah, that's true.
Which isn't quite as spot on as some of the other castings, but totally works.
You know, it's interesting. That's the only one that's not in italics. I don't know if that means anything necessarily, but it is the only one that he chose not to render in italics.
In quotes, but not in italic.
Yeah.
Also, the way that the movies are cited in this and in Vineland are in, is it APA or Chicago style citations?
Chicago.
Yeah, and I think this is, up until that point, the italics, I think, is the correct way in the Chicago style guide to format it. And I'm inclined to agree with the Pynchon Wiki's conclusion that it's just an editing issue.
Mm-hmm.
Especially with things like CD way back at this point, around page 300 or something. Being capitalized when it wouldn't be, or like some of the other small things. I think this book is kind of failed by its editing.
A little bit, like even like the small stuff, like when hypnotic is brought up earlier in chapter 40, the first time it's in there, there's no Y, which is the correct spelling. Hypnotic is HPNOTIQ, and then the second time it's brought up when Talus reaches for it, it's HYPNOTIQ. Like just small things are missed. And it's surprising.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is that this is Thomas Pynchon. It totally could be intentional, and there might be some intended meaning.
Some of it is what leads certain people to think the whole book takes place in Deep Archer. Like in some of the stuff that I have read where people are advancing that theory. They're like, well, it talks about how everything is constantly being edited and changed since the source code was released. So, of course, maybe the bottle did say hypnotic without a Y the first time, and maybe it did the second time because it was literally edited between that time by whoever was changing the source code, so on and so forth.
I don't know. That's a bit of a stretch. I think more of it takes place in Deep Archer than people might realize or might think, but I don't think the whole thing does. And I think also you could also write it off as just this is the alternate America, and maybe they spelled it differently there. Who knows?
Yeah. It absolutely is. Also, these are books written by human people, and nobody's perfect.
Mistakes happen, yeah. Jesus, people, lay off.
Well, and my frustration with that is that, like, these are novels. This is Thomas Pynchon. He has clearly addressed through his use of style throughout his career, he has addressed that issue. And it would be insanely lame, at the very least, of him to start using it in such a symbolic gesture. That would just suck. But hey, some of us get lame when we get old.
Hey now.
Hey, you're not 80.
Halfway there.
You got a ways to go.
Yeah,
that brings us to quotes next. Does anyone feel particularly beholden to go first?
I guess I will. Mine's towards the end. It's on page 475. After they've left and are heading back in the car, Maybe it's this luxury lounge interior 40 years down the road with not yet damped vibrations of Midwest teen fantasies that have worked their way into the grain of the metallic turquoise vinyl, the loop carpet floor mats, the ashtrays overflowing with ancient cigarette butts, some with lipstick shades not sold for years, each with a history of some romantic vigil, some high-speed pursuit, whatever Horst saw in this rolling museum of desire when he answered the ad in the Penny Saver back when it was set. Back whenever it was. Set and setting, as Dr. Tim always liked to say now. Presently, he has wrapped them, brought them in from the unprofitable drill fields of worry about the future, here inside, to repose, to unfurrowing, each eventually to her own dreams. Just a beautiful passage about the inside of this gross car that Horst owns, but making it feel very romanticized, I guess, in a weird way. Like I want to be in that car, but I don't want to be in that car. I've been in that car too. But yeah, it's just, I mean, that is just a wonderfully written passage and
yeah, it is.
Great scene setting.
Will, since I've stolen a precipitous number of quotes from you over the course of this season of the show, do you want to go next?
Sure. I've got a few candidates, but I'm gonna go for the one that really jumped out to me while recording the episode. Right at the start of chapter 41. In the train on the way back, Maxine must have fallen asleep. She dreams she's still in the Zil. The landscape out the windows is frozen to deep Russian midwinter, snowfields under a piece of moon, illumination from the olden days of sleigh travel. A snow-inundated village, a church spire, a gas station shut for the night. Crossfade to Brothers Karamazov, Dr. Zhivago, and others. Covering their winter distances like this, frictionless, faster than anything else, suddenly you can get more than one errand done per trip. A breakthrough in romantic technology. Somewhere between Lake Keatsink and Albany, across the dark wilderness, a fleet of black SUVs now with only their fog lights lit. On the way to intercept, Maxine falls into an exitless. Yeah, my tongue is not working. Maxine falls into an exitless loop. The dream as she surfaces turning into a spreadsheet she can't follow. She wakes up around Spoiton Doiville to Talis' sleeping face, closer to her own than you'd expect, as if sometime in sleep their faces had been even closer.
Yeah, that's a really good one.
I don't have anything. There's no interpretation. There's nothing to it except that both textually and like motif wise, and it's just it's a beautiful little message.
My favorite part of that is at the end when she remarks on how close their faces are. I love that part of it. My quote comes from the beginning of chapter 40 when he's describing the apartment complex. There's a second paragraph here that I really love where it says, "Out here at the far ancient edge of the island, this all used to be train yard. Deep below, trains still move through tunnels in and out of Penn Station, horns chiming in B major 6 deepest dream. While ghosts of tunnel wall artists and squatters the civil authorities have no clue what to do about. Evict, ignore, re-evict, go drifting past the train car windows in the semi-dark, whispering messages of transients, and overhead in this cheaply built apartment complex tenants come and go, relentlessly ephemeral as travelers in a 19th century railroad hotel." I love that quote so much. It's right. Just it has such like an understanding of history, I guess is the way that I would put it, of how like land development happens and how, you know, what used to be one thing becomes another, and how, you know, there is some similarity between all of them, even when you don't immediately think that necessarily. And that it's one of these moments of like this book using New York as a character, as it's listed kind of in that monograph at the beginning, where it's that Donald Westlake quote. It's just such a good example of that, of like all of the different ways in which he's talked about trains or buildings or the history of the city or the redevelopment of the city or the people in the city. It's such an incredible quote. And my favorite quote of the previous set of chapters that I missed was when she's talking about seeing the faces in train cars as tarot cards.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And then having, you know, kind of a return to that, to a similar motif here, and just how, like, yeah, it's not a train hotel anymore, but it is somewhat of a hotel still. because people don't spend time in here for all the reasons that we already talked about. It's such a great quote. All right, so that does bring us to most pinch on part in the chapter. What did you guys have?
I think for me, I want to say it's the scene with Misha and Grisha in Igor's car. Just the whole just bizarre scene, if like when you really extrapolate what's going on, is very pinch on. Just everything happening all at once. There's some serious like they're about to commit a felony, but they're acting like goofballs, driving around hotboxing a Zill and listening to Nelly at insanely high volume, while they've ostensibly taken 2 people as hostages for a ransom job that won't work now because they didn't really think it through. Wonderful. I love it.
Yeah. I mean, I like the obvious one is the lunch that March and and Talus and Maxine all have, right? Like that's the obvious one to point out. So I just I don't want to always pick the obvious one, but another one doesn't come to mind.
And it's obvious for a reason, right?
Yeah.
I mean, these 2 chapters are so dense with like Pynchon's very clearly intentional tongue-in-cheek references to his previous books that I think you could basically pick anything.
Yeah, it's true.
That's
have
fair.
a strong argument for it. I mean, like the quote that Cody you read out for your favorite quote. I mean, that is so incredibly Pynchonian because not only do you have like kind of a return to Mucho Moss staring at the inside of a car and overanalyzing it.
Yeah.
But you also get like this breakdown where Maxine stops being the narrator very clearly. Maxine very likely knows who Timothy Leary was. She does not think of him as Dr. Tim. That's not something that's going on in her head. You have that complete like narrative breakdown there. But that's not my choice for most Pynchon part. I'm actually going to pick a part that was already read out in that lunch scene. The description of how they chose Zippy's appetizing, the way that it flips the focal point, the way that it like you start with a conversation, the quote ends, it jumps all the way to them having made their decision, and then jumps back to why in particular they might have chosen that location, which is situated as the thing which Talus is ordering in gross detail, it's in large macro detail of the sandwich, only finally arriving at the point, which is also, dotted with a camera work allusion with a allotted by the takeout menu. Talus instantly zooms. Like that is so Pynchon, and that's what I like. When if anyone's been wondering what I've been referring to constantly throughout this book as the Gravity's Rainbow style kind of coming back, it's that degree of like looseness with how sentences and narrative is conveyed. Because in Vineland you have the like coming out of the back corner is this character. Here's where he came from. And you get bits and pieces of that throughout all of his books post Gravity's Rainbow. But Gravity's Rainbow is nothing but that. And so is this book. It's subtler. It's not in your face except for in those kinds of moments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That I think is probably the best way to depict why this book has garnered the reputation it has, that it's subtler.
Definitely. Yeah.
Well, that brings us to the end of our read through of Bleeding Edge. This has been great. I've had a great time just absolutely, I guess, nerding out over one of my favorite Pynchon books, the one that I've read a ton. There's just so much good stuff to uncover, and I hope that everybody who listened to these episodes got something out of it. We do have some listener comments and questions. We got quite a few from Reddit. First one here comes from somebody going by the username Pokemon in my body. And
great name.
They said, really enjoyed your discussions. I've always rated Bleeding Edge highly, so it's been great to hear from other Pinch-On fans who are so positive about it. Thank you. I fucking love this book. Pokemon in my body. Hopefully hearing me blather on about it so much in series of info dumps over the course of the last 4 months has been a great experience for you, in addition to all of the other great detail given by Luke and Cody and Will as we've gone through. Cody, do you want to read the next one?
Yeah, so the next one comes from Leather Papaya 5540. Keep them coming with the great names, guys. Your discussion confirmed Bleeding Edge once again to be my favorite and most eloquently insightful love letter to New York City and its inhabitants. It absolutely is that.
Yeah, 100%. I love that Donald E. Westlake quote that he includes at the beginning. It sets up a good chunk of what the book is really about. Will, you want to read the next?
Sure. From the Infra Wolf. Holy damn, this is a gem. Appreciate the work you put into this. I've been looking for complimentary material on Pynchon, and this comes very handy. Will you do episodes on Gravity's Rainbow anytime? And
eventually.
I think Cody already got
some
back
point.
to you. But yeah, in case anyone didn't, in case anyone else is wondering, we will get there. It's not the next book, but we will get there eventually.
Last, we have another one from Reddit here from Marlowe's Coffee Maker. Again, just what a series of great usernames. Love the show. Keep it up. Thank you. Smiley face. I love your username, Marlowe, and I love you. Thank you for listening. Cody, do you want to take the one from Twitter?
Yeah, we had on Twitter, Walker Adams said, excited to get to finally follow you guys with one I haven't read yet. Been listening for about a year and a half now. Thank you for listening and sticking with us for so long. And hopefully your first read through of Bleeding Edge is as fun as we had talking about it. And hopefully we can contribute something to your read through.
Yes, please email us and let us know what you think. Just because we're not doing this season anymore does not mean that we don't want to hear from you guys as far as your experiences reading the books and anything that you may get out of it. So, and that goes for everything. Yeah,
if back to old ones. Yeah,
if people have observations on Mason and Dixon, or if people have observations on Vineland or Crying of Lot 49, feel free to still email those to us and let us know what you think, and we'll still talk about it on the show.
We also did have another wonderful comment on Apple Podcasts. That I would be remiss to not bring up. This was, I have to say, this is a 5-star review, so thank you. WJH503. The review is titled "Plop Go the Donkeys," and it says the misguided, execrable anti-Journey sentiment is balanced out well by a possible appreciation for Steve Lukather. I don't think we dunked on Journey that much last week. We did a little bit, just mentioned that we didn't really like them. Don't really have a problem with Steve Lukather either. The dude did the Werner from Thriller, so he's got that going for him. But I the last several like Apple Podcast reviews we've gotten have been wonderfully weird. So please keep sending those. They're hilarious, and I don't want reviews that are just like, "This is a good show, listen to it." That's the kind of stuff I want. Is weird, tangentially related stuff.
If you could possibly explain what you mean by "Plop Go the Donkeys," I would appreciate it personally.
I have to wonder if that's on it. To your point about Shrek last week, I think it might have something to do with that.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I was thinking maybe it's like a mashup of Journey song titles.
Oh, maybe.
Or something. I have no clue.
I don't know that Journey ever had a song with the word plop in it, but if they did, I want to hear it.
Or donkeys.
Yeah.
Maybe Steve Lukather or Toto did.
Who knows?
Maybe WJH503 is Steve Lukather.
Maybe.
For the same reasons that I not for the same reasons at all, but for the same reasons I love Africa by Toto, I do love donkeys. So 2 thumbs up.
Next week we're going to be doing a wrap-up episode as we usually do, and we're going to be bringing a guest on. Cody coordinated that. Do you want to include what you were thinking about it?
So we managed to reach out and get Andrew, who most of our listeners probably know better as Byron's Glowing Filament from Twitter. He did the Gravity's Rainbow Analysis Substack. Well, he's still working on it as far as I know, which is an amazing resource for Gravity's Rainbow. If y'all aren't aware of it, I'll have that in the show notes, and we'll have Andrew kind of give some more detail on that when he's on here next week. But yeah, I'm really excited about that, especially I think the idea of reaching out to him came when we started talking about this being the sort of New Testament to Gravity's Rainbow's Old Testament. I figured there's, probably no one better we can reach out to about Gravity's Rainbow right now than him. So I want to get his thoughts on the connections that are there and just his thoughts in general on this book. So it's going to be a fun one.
Yeah, absolutely will. We are also comfortable at this time announcing what our next book is going to be. So I don't have a drum kit in front of me, unfortunately.
I'll find something to put in.
Yeah,
there you go.
That in post.
Yeah,
I got you. Don't worry.
Do you make like a really weird drum roll too? Like not a normal one?
No, it'll be weird for sure.
13/8 or
reverb.
The next book we will be reading, as has been requested more than any other, is Against the Day by Thomas Pynchon. This is going to be quite an undertaking. I think everybody, not only on the podcast, but also that listens to our podcast, understands the degree of an undertaking that a book like this is going to be. It's also probably why there is no real analysis of this book in the public domain. This is a 1,000-page Thomas Pynchon novel. The concept of breaking that down and going through it is quite an undertaking.
I think Leaf by Leaf did like a 3 or 4 hour video on it.
Right.
That's about the closest I can think that anyone's come to like really approaching this from an in-depth level. But yeah, this is going to take us a while.
So commensurate with the fact that it is going to take us a while, that season of the show, we are going to be switching to a bi-weekly schedule. So instead of an episode coming out every Friday, as you guys have enjoyed for a year and a half now, we want to make sure that we have the time to put in to not just read the book week to week, but also to prepare our notes and prepare our discussion topics for it, and to make sure that those episodes, after they're edited, go out in as high of a quality as they possibly can for all of you, because of the degree to which this book has been requested above any other. So that is going to be the primary change that you're going to experience once we come back with season 5 of Mapping the Zone. And that does, of course, mean that we will be covering this book for a long time. But hopefully you will all enjoy as exhaustive as we will end up being, given that space that we're going to be able to give ourselves and you as the listener to enjoy the book.
Yeah, that's going to be fun, but it's going to be a lot. So that's the main reason for the change in schedule is just, we want to make sure we can do the best we can and that we all 4 of us, have the time we need to make it good and to not, go insane from spending the next couple of years talking about the same book.
Right.
But it's going to be good, and we'll continue to pepper in bonus episodes here and there to make sure that it's not it doesn't feel like that's all we're doing is just Against the Day. But it will be an undertaking, but we are all, I think, looking forward to it.
Yeah, agreed. If you like what we're doing, if you like this episode, if you think this episode of the podcast is worth $1, we would love to have it. So if you are interested in providing any kind of a donation or any kind of funds to the show, we do have a Ko-Fi account. We are on Ko-Fi at Mapping the Zone. That is ko-fi.com/Mapping the Zone. Any money that you do send to us is going to be used to upgrade our equipment, pay hosting fees, and do anything that we need in order to make the show better, like buying materials or books or supporting the operations here at the podcast. And otherwise, we will be back next week with that interview with Byron the Bulb. Until then, you can get in touch with us at our email address. That's mappingthezonepod@gmail.com. You can reach out to us on Twitter at twitter.com/PynchonPod. And we are also on Instagram at Mapping the Zone Podcast. And thank you, as always, for listening.
Bye.
Bye.
I mean, I love chicken liver.
I've never had it.
I can't say I have either.
It's delicious. I mean, I prefer mammal livers, but I'll settle for what I can get. I just want my organ meats.
Mm-hmm.
Like I that out and sample it sometime later.
I just want my organ meats. If Will ever needs to go get a blood transfusion, he should just play that soundbite.
But Will ate with pleasure.
Yeah. I will say they don't describe the rest of the sandwich, but they did. Someone did get a sandwich that has potato salad on it, and that is an underrated topping for a sandwich. I've had like pastrami sandwiches with potato salad on them. Very good, very good. Put that on some rye bread. I
could see that.
Some spicy brown mustard.
I have to say, the reason I asked which sandwich is because the one Maxine gets, the turkey pastrami health combo, sounds god awful.
Whose menu copy promises alfalfa sprouts, portobello mushrooms, avocados, low-fat mayo, and more in a way of redemptive add-ons.
Yeah, I mean, look, ignoring the atrocity that is the concept of low-fat mayonnaise.
Yeah.
Putting low-fat mayo on a sandwich with avocado is insane.
Mm-hmm.
It's just none of it. That's not. Look, it's not that it's vegetables. I'm all for vegetables. I'm all for putting a salad on bread. That in particular is like the epitome of like what people think when they mean to when they call something rabbit food. It's that.
Mm-hmm.
It's nothing but like signifiers of health piled on I imagine a whole grain bread.
Has to be one of those breads that's like hard to chew.
Yeah,
it's like there's like bird food in it,
and it immediately disintegrates. Like the moment you take a bite, the whole thing just starts to fall apart.
Yeah.
I fucking hate bread like that, man. There's
no cohesion to it.
It's so bad. There was a moment. My mother is a very stereotypical Jewish mother in a lot of ways, but one of them is that like she would start to get these different periods where she was like, "We're gonna get really healthy. No more bad food." And that usually manifested in a change in one or two different ways, but not like a complete overhauling of the kitchen or like any of the ingredients we used or whatever. And one of the times it was that she thought that if we just had bread like that, everything would be good. Another time, she also thought that the introduction of couscous to our diet would be the fix to the health issues, because we just had so much couscous for like 3 months.
Oh my God.
There was a time for maybe like 6 months where all we had in the house bread-wise was just that awful birdseed filled whole grain bread that disintegrates as soon as you touch it.
Held together by hopes and dreams.
It's so hard to eat a single piece of that. You'll be working on it for 20 years. It's like a union job. I just, oh man, I'm so glad I don't have to eat that anymore.
Well, and I like, again, personally, I for one really enjoy like whole grain bread that is just like an excuse to put seeds in. But there's a difference between like Ezekiel bread, although it is often incredibly dry and unchewable and not
Ezekiel bread's rough.
Yeah. But I personally, I don't mind it. And like, I think the newer kind of version of that kind of thing is like Dave's organic
killer bread.
Yeah. But just as another PSA to the world, you can get like edible and decent tasting versions of that. You don't have to get like the ones that are completely free of carbohydrates that are not fiber. Like there are edible and taste-filled forms of whole grain, multi-grain breads. But for some reason, the diet culture in America drives especially mothers to buy flavorless, useless. Like it won't hold a sandwich together. You can't make toast with it. It's awful. That stuff's horrible.
Yeah, it's truly a scourge. In case you're wondering what kind of bread Will is talking about, go to an actual health food store instead of like the healthy bread aisle at like a Walmart or like a grocery store. You're gonna have like actual like good experiences with like whole grain bread if you get it from an actual like place that supplies it.
Now you will pay $10 for a loaf.
That's true.
Yeah.
You will pay $10 for a loaf, but it is worth it occasionally.
Yeah, and one piece of toast will be a complete breakfast.
Yes, yeah. One piece of toast with like maybe some like ricotta cheese and jam, and that's a very solid breakfast right there. Now I'm hungry. Just not for Dave's Killer Bread.
It's still better than like the main brand's whole wheat stuff, at least.
Yes, that's true. I just can't deal with the fact that Dave actually killed a guy and is now marketing his food products underneath the name Dave's Killer Bread.
What better way to stay under the radar?
Yeah. Well, he went to jail for it. Like he served his time.
It's the same reason I refuse to pile on Where the Crawdads Sing. I think that if you're willing to
the book by Delia Owens.
Yep. If you're willing to put your murder in the center of your public persona, I think you deserve more respect than scorn. I like that your laughter is breaking Discord's noise algorithm.
Oh, I was not anticipating hearing a connection between Dave's Killer Bread and Where the Crawdads Sing tonight. Oh, God.
Look, the reason that the dog is in this recording is because my parents decided that they would go to see the film adaptation of It Ends With Us.
Oh, no. No.
And I can only pray that it is as mediocre as the film adaptation of Where the Crawdads Sing.
Aggressively mediocre.
Yeah.
Mediocre to the point of being offensive.
I mean, that movie is so... I wouldn't even go that far. It is like right down the middle. So uninteresting. You know, Barnes and Noble.
Barnes and Noble was selling tote bags for that book for a while. And when the movie was coming out, and every time I would go into a Barnes and Noble and I'd see that fucking tote bag at the front of the counter, I'd be like, do they understand how like weird this is? That they're selling a tote bag with a quote from a book about a murder that was committed, like in real life.
Oh, I thought you meant It Ends With Us, and I was so concerned that there's like a class of people walking around with bags that just say It Ends With Us. Because that's a different kind and very horrible grimness.
Yeah. No, it was a tote bag. It was like a linen tote bag that had a quote from Where the Crawdads Sing on it. And it was like credited as that. It wasn't just like the quote and then like, you know, like flowers or whatever. It was the quote that said Where the Crawdads Sing. And they were doing that when the movie was coming out. And I just every time I looked at it, I was like, something about this feels wrong.
Look, murder is okay as long as they are disposed of in a swamp by a burgeoning zoologist. That's the message.
That's the takeaway there.
I think one of the villains in True Detective Season 1 said that, actually. Oh, God.
Time is a flat circle, and if you're a zoologist, I think you should be able to murder whoever you want.
As long as you dump them in a swamp in Louisiana. This is going to make for a great post-show material.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Oh my God. Matthew McConaughey just listening to him say that as he's tied up. He's got a point. There's nothing we can do about that truth. Let me wax poetic on the philosophy of pessimism for a second while I point this AK-47 at him. Oh, God.
When you understand your place in the ecosystem, it's as good as a license to kill.
He's really doing us a favor. That being said, season 1 of that show is like one of the best 8-hour blocks of television ever created.
I do like that Nick Pizzolatto read one book, decided to put the ideas from that book into a character, and then it was made painfully obvious in the following years that he did not understand what was in that book.
No.
And he didn't understand the fact that most people just they might have liked the character that Matthew McConaughey was playing, but nobody thought he was correct.
No. Everyone understood that he was believing in Schopenhauer philosophy as a way to deal with the loss of his daughter. It was a coping mechanism.
But the writer did not.
The writer did not understand that. The writer was like, look at how cool this guy's personal philosophy is. And then the audience for his show was like, that's going to be a yikes from me, man. And then they permanently kept that stance through season 2 and 3. What a letdown that show was as soon as season 2 came out.
But he quote Nietzsche.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's such an interesting show. So promising. So promising, only for it to be revealed as soon as there was more of it, that this writer kind of had one idea. And they've just been trying to rework that territory. The new one with Jodie Foster also sucked, and Nick Pizzolatto wasn't even involved in that.
So did HBO/Warner basically think that the reason that people liked the first season was dark tones and an A-list celebrity?
That seems to be what it is, yeah. Yeah, because that was all they did. Nick Pizzolatto did the second season, and it has a very troubled production history that might explain why that one in particular is really, really bad. But it has A-list stars in it. And then season 3 is better than season 2, but is not good, and still has an A-list star in Mahershala Ali. And then Nick Pizzolatto didn't want to keep doing the show, even though after season 1, I think he signed a contract for 5 more seasons of True Detective as being the writer. And then they took the same formula and they applied it to a different show, but it still is not good, even though it's gotten a ton of praise. What was missing from seasons 2 and 3 of True Detective was not an X-Files angle.
Jodie Foster, though.
Yeah, Jodie Foster's great.
I think that's most of why it has the critical reception it does, because hey, it's Jodie Foster. She's good.
Got 19 Emmy nominations or some crazy shit, though. But yes, always good for Jodie Foster. She deserves everything. I don't even remember where we left off. Oh, I actually put my bookmark in the page.
Yay.
But I think so. This is going to be a weird connection to make, but in the Fairy Odd Parents, Doug Dimsdale, owner of the Dimsdale Dimmadome, drives around in a white stretch limousine that's like impossibly long because it's a children's cartoon. But I think he's based off of a Dallas character.
Dallas inspired a weird amount of television, and thank you for reminding me that Fairly Odd Parents existed because that show was great.
So, I'm sorry, I need to correct you. His name is Doug Dimmadome.
What did I call him?
Doug Dimsdale.
Oh, Doug Dimsdale. Gotcha. Yeah.
The name is even better, given that it makes no sense as a name.
Yeah.
It is. He's always got to say his full title too. Owner of the Dimsdale Dimmadome.
Well, here I found this, which maybe approximates what Ice was driving around in.
Oh my god!
Well, that's a sweet ride.
That's
right?
That's belongs on an episode of Miami Vice.
It's got a lot going on. It's got speed stripes.
Why the triple rear axle?
Why not?
No,
they probably got 4 CRT TVs in the back that weigh 500 pounds each.
The why not is because like the amount of mechanical failure states you're adding in. It's insane. The transmission.
I'm trying to figure out what's going on the back of it. There's like a weird. I mean, it's got the spoiler for one, which why? But there's something on the back that looks like the back of a Star Trek ship.
Is it a luggage rack?
I don't know.
I think it's a spoiler, Cody.
Another one? Because there's a one on the top, like the highest point of it. But then there's one on the very back that looks like, I don't know. I need to know more about this car.
As do I now. I mean, it's serious. It's like something out of an anime.
It is. This belongs in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure.
Oh my.
It's got the undercarriage turn signals. I think that's what those are. On the rear? That's insane. That it genuinely looks like they took a bunch of Cadillacs and literally just welded them together. But
it's a real Frankenstein thing.
They didn't throw away the axles. They didn't throw away the drivetrain. They just put them together.
Yeah, just gotta squish it together.
God, there's got to be so much cocaine on the floor of that limo.
It might be made of cocaine.
It might.
It might be.
The body is made of cocaine.
Just compressed.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Oh, you know what those are on the back? Those are TV antenna.
Oh, there you go. That makes sense.
That's
Dear God.
How do you
gotta get a signal to those CRT TVs.
How do you turn something that big?
4 years in advance.
Yeah. It's like the episode of Top Gear where they all have to make their own limos, and Jeremy Clarkson's idea of making his own limo is just making it the longest car he possibly can, and then it's impossible for him to drive it around London. And it like literally snaps in half, I think, at one point when he's trying to turn around a corner. It's one of the best episodes of that show.
That thing better have a rear engine.
Oh, it has to, right?
I don't know how it would work.
Hopes and dreams, man.
You have
It's the whole wheat bread of cars.
Whole wheat bread of car.
The drivetrain goes for like 20 feet, and then it hits 3 axles.
The engine is powered on cocaine, too.
It's a V12, yeah.
That's a serious car. Serious car for a serious person.
Very serious. Is that leather on the panels towards the rear?
It sure looks like it.
It does. And there's like shoelaces or some sort of applique like over the leather too.
It's like the diamond stitching on like
yeah.
Trying to remember the brand. They're like a back in the days of bench seats.
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
Anyway, but looking at the front of the car, it's so long that the brain wants to interpret the front as like a Suburban, and on the back, it's clearly a monstrosity. So it just doesn't have anything to do with it. But as you pan from left to right, it makes less sense.
I'll put a link to this image in the show notes so readers aren't
you're gonna
confused as to what we're
have
talking about.
to.
Where did you find this thing?
I literally Googled Dallas TV show White Limo and went to the images, and that was, I think, the third one. Yep, third one. It's from an article on The Drive called The Larger-Than-Life Tale of Vinny Big Daddy Bergman, the Limo King of Los Angeles.
Wow.
Anyway, Gabriel Ice.
Gabriel Ice is a surreal psycho.